Every month in my city, there's this event held at a downtown music venue. Basically, people get up on stage and tell 5-minute stories, all related to whatever the theme of the night is. I've been attending these storytelling events pretty religiously since I discovered them last fall, and have actually become a somewhat established storyteller there. It's always fun for me to listen as well as talk, and it's one of the few places I feel comfortable going to at night by myself. So, I'm one of the first people in, as I'm a kiss-ass and was hoping to help out the people who work there with the setup. Everything was done by the time I got there, though, so I just found a good seat and waited for the fun to begin. A man who's around 30 years old came up to me and said, "I like your shorts. May I give you a hug?" This set off every alarm in my head, but I always try to give people the benefit of the doubt, so I figured he meant no harm and gave him a hug. He told me I was very beautiful, to which I gave him a "thanks, man," and the interaction was done. A little weird, but then I saw him hug another woman a few feet away from me, so I thought maybe he's just weirdly affectionate. I thought little more of it. Time passed, and after I'd had fun conversations with strangers and told a story on stage, it was intermission. I decided to go to my car and grab my sketchbook because I was feeling fidgety. On the way out, I saw the guy from before. Trying to be friendly, I asked, "Well, how did I do?" He gave me another hug and said, "You were wonderful. You were wonderful." I thanked him and let go. But he didn't let go of me, and he kissed me on my neck. Maybe it was only for a second, but it felt like forever that I was stuck there with him. I don't even remember how I reacted. I was so shocked that I just took off, looking over my shoulder to make sure he hadn't followed me to my car. I went back to the venue, determined not to let this ruin my night, but the truth is, I don't really remember any of the stories from the second half because I was so shaken up that I couldn't focus. I was texting my mom the whole time, trying not to freak out too much. After the show, I found Janice, a 40-something mom who also is a storytelling regular and in the past has walked with me to my car after these events. I told her what happened, and she stayed with me until I was in my car. Weird Guy was nowhere to be found once I wasn't alone. I'm so grateful for women like Janice. I feel a lot of different emotions about what happened. Scared by his actions, angry that I was taken advantage of, sad that the one place I felt really safe in doesn't feel safe anymore. I wanted so badly to just be kind to another person, and he used that against me. You bet I won't be giving any hugs to strangers, or going there alone anymore. I thought I was just being a puss about something that happened to me years back, until I saw a post about something similar here on Let's Not Meet. In college, my boyfriend and I lived about half an hour apart. I had limited free time due to work, school, etc. So on weekends, we'd hang out for marathon stretches. Many times, I wouldn't end up leaving his neighborhood until around 1 or 2 a.m. The aforementioned neighborhood was a beautiful suburban town. Super safe. I wanted to move there with my son someday for the killer school district. But driving home at night along those dark, winding suburban roads by myself in my shitty 13-year-old sedan was another thing. Being the type of person who is obsessed with the types of stories and situations that this subreddit focuses on, I knew that every time I took that 30-minute drive through the empty, dark roads, I was making myself vulnerable. I always wore an oversized hoodie over my hair to disguise the fact that I was female, because I know those stories. I kept my hood up and my eyes on the rearview mirror for any of the few cars that ended up being on the road with me. So, when eventually, a few months into my routine, I looked back at a car that was rapidly converging on my bumper, I wasn't really surprised. But I was scared. I sped up, on the off chance that this was just a person who needed to get home at 15 miles per hour over the speed limit and was annoyed with my adherence to the posted signs. Nope. No matter how much I sped up, he clung to my bumper as if our cars were linked magnetically. My heart was racing, but I was calmed by a conviction that no matter what happened, I wasn't getting out of the goddamned car. You never get out of the car. If I just stayed in the car and got home, I'd be safe. And if he followed me all the way home, he could come at me in my driveway with my 3 brothers I was going to call and wake up. I just had to make it another 25 minutes, 20 minutes, 15 minutes. He continued to follow close. At the halfway point, I stop at a light, all adrenaline. He pulls up next to my car. A middle-aged white guy, goatee. His eyes are wild behind his glasses as he frantically motions for me to roll down my window for a solid 60 seconds straight. He's desperate, almost pleading. I finally comply, out of a bizarre pity. When my window is down, he brays in one of the most earnest voices I've ever heard. Don't drive scared. Just drive home. And peeled the fuck off. To which I have to say, don't drive like an insane monster. Just drive home. And also, well-meaning car stalker, let's not meet again. It was a chilly Wednesday evening in October when I was 14. I was standing in our kitchen waiting for my father to drive me to church school. My father, meanwhile, was stomping back and forth from the living room through the basement to the basement stairs. He would go to the top of the stairs and yell down at my 17-year-old sister who was also getting ready to leave. She had a meeting of her church group to go to, but since her meeting wasn't at the church, she was driving herself. Since she was taking her time, my father would yell down the stairs for her to hurry up and then stomp back towards the living room and look for his keys, which he had misplaced. So, there was my father, standing at the top of the stairs and yelling to my sister in the basement. Behind him was our back door. The back door was open, but the screen door was closed. My father then moved away from the screen door, and there she was. A girl, standing in our driveway and peering in through the screen door. Peering, I guess, isn't the right word. She was staring. She was tall and slender, with straight black hair tied into a ponytail. She looked a few years older than my sister. It was her eyes, however, that were the most noticeable. They were huge and unblinking. Her eyes would dart around the inside of our kitchen, scanning the room. And then she noticed me. I was still standing in my spot, leaning against the kitchen counter. I wasn't especially creeped out at this point, just curious. And I did start to get a little worried when she took a step forward and reached for the handle of the screen door. At this moment, my father rushed past me. "Got him," he said while clutching his keys. "Let's go." As he moved closer to the screen door, he noticed the girl. "Oh, hi," I heard him say to the girl from my position behind him. He opened the door and then turned to shout down the stairs, "Steph, it's time to go." "All right," my sister responded in that annoyed teenage girl voice of hers as she came running up the stairs. My dad held the door open for her and I and pulled it shut behind us. My sister and the girl started walking down the driveway to my sister's car. I think my dad and I had the same thought. They didn't acknowledge each other. 2 teenage girls didn't bother saying hello to each other. I'd been around my sister and her friends long enough to know that they could barely stop speaking when they were together. We stood in front of the garage watching the 2 of them walk away. When they reached the car, my sister put her key in the door and unlocked it. The girl, now standing by the passenger door, tried the handle. It was locked. The next moment plays out in slow motion in my mind. I remember my sister, still holding the door handle, slowly looking up at the girl with the big eyes and saying, "Can I help you?" My dad heard it too, and began quickly walking down the driveway. My sister looked at him with a confused stare. He turned to the girl and repeated my sister's question. "Can I help you?" Her eyes darting from my dad to my sister to me, she looked back to my dad and said something I will never forget. "You have my grandmother in your basement." My dad looked at the girl and said what we were all thinking. What? Now, I may not have spent a lot of time in our basement as my room was upstairs, but I was down there every day. The biggest TV was down there, the laundry room was down there, my hockey equipment was stored in the furnace room, and my sister's room was down there. So I'm pretty sure I would have noticed someone's grandma in our basement. The girl, however, seemed convinced. She began to rant about how her pastor had told her we were devil worshippers and that we were trying to kill her and planned to sacrifice her grandmother. I was getting pretty creeped out by this point, not just by what she was saying, but by how she moved. The way her eyes kept moving around rapidly, the way her hands were shaking. My sister and I both stood frozen to the concrete of the driveway. My dad, however, didn't panic. He'd been a paramedic my entire life. He'd definitely seen his share of strange things and dealt with people with mental health issues. He calmly told my sister and I to go inside. Neither of us moved. He said it again, more forcefully than before, and we began to walk backwards up the driveway. The girl began to look very confused. She looked at the three of us and began to make almost a whimpering noise. She started moving up the driveway as well, while walking almost sideways. My dad took a step closer to her and the whimpering intensified. "Just stay right here with me," my dad said calmly, "and we'll figure this out." The girl moved faster up the driveway towards me, the whimpering reaching a crescendo before she lunged at me, and the whimpering became a scream. "No!" the girl cried while reaching both hands out to me. I turned to run. My father lunged at the girl and was able to grab both of her arms and pull them behind her back. My sister and I ran into the house and slammed the door behind us as the girl violently flailed against my father's grip. Once inside, my sister and I rushed to the window on the side of the house. We could see my dad now struggling to subdue the girl as her flailing continued. He began guiding her up the driveway towards the garage. When they were both inside, he closed the garage door. I stared at my dad while the door came down. I remember the feeling of terror as the door made contact with the cement. We couldn't see him. There were no windows on the garage door anymore. There had been, but I broke them all with an errant slap shot, and now, where there were windows, there was only plywood. My sister and I stood in the kitchen, crying and staring at the garage door for what seemed like an eternity. Finally, the side door opened and my dad looked at us through the kitchen window. "It's okay," he said. "Just call 911 and tell them to send an ambulance." Behind him, we heard the girl crying. My sister called the emergency dispatcher and we waited. Moments later, the ambulance pulled into the driveway and my dad opened the garage door. The girl was bent over at the waist and sobbing loudly. My dad greeted his colleagues, who ran into the garage and calmly and gently guided the girl toward the back of the ambulance. We could hear her wailing as the ambulance backed down the driveway. When the ambulance had pulled away, my sister and I sprinted to the garage and embraced our father. It had been a frightening experience that could have gone much worse if it weren't for him. I was working at a small college on the East Coast in the physical education department. I taught classes, worked as a strength and conditioning coach for their athletic teams, and had a separate contract with the school so I could use their facilities for personal training. It was a very active campus. There were many trails around and through the campus for joggers and cyclists. The only time of the year that there weren't a lot of people on campus were the first 2 weeks of August. During that time, the place was a ghost town. All buildings on campus had their power cut, so the school could save some money. The only buildings that still had power were the administration and physical education buildings. In order to understand what happened, I have to explain the setup of the building, as it can be somewhat confusing. It's built into the side of a hill and has 4 floors. There are 3 entrances. The first floor entrance, which could be considered the back of the building, faces west. The main entrance, which is on the 3rd floor, faces east, and a side entrance, also on the 3rd floor, faces south. Confused? That's all right. It's going to get stranger in a minute. The 3rd floor entrance leads to a small parking lot on the side of the hill. That's the faculty and staff parking lot. That's where I go in. I walk in that door, which leads to a basketball court and 2 flights of stairs to the 2nd floor. Going down these 2 flights of stairs leads you to my office and a small gym area I use to train athletes and clients. On a Saturday in early August, I'd finished with my last client of the day and decided to stay a little late and get a workout in. Since I didn't want anybody walking in the building while I was wearing headphones and the only person authorized to be there, I locked the south door and set the security system. When I was finished working out, I went into my office to finish some work and get things ready for that Monday. The blaring of the alarm system got my attention, and I walked to the nearest keypad, which was down the hall. The display showed that the alarm on the 1st floor entrance had been tripped. I turned off the alarm and headed downstairs. It wasn't the first time this happened, and I thought it could have been a jogger or cyclist who needed a drink or to use the bathroom or was hurt in some way. When I got to the 1st floor entrance, there was no one in sight. I opened the door, looked around, and still didn't see anyone. Figuring that they had already left, I pulled the door shut, made sure it was locked, and turned back to the stairs. That was when I heard it. On the stairs above me, there was a stomp. Stomp. "Hello?" I said. Stomp. Stomp. "Hello?" I yelled again in a louder and deeper voice to let whoever was there know I wasn't messing around. Stomp. "God damn it," I muttered as I began climbing the stairs, listening to the stomping echo my own footsteps. I reached the 2nd floor and still heard the stomping above me. "Hello?" I yelled again. I reached the 3rd floor and still heard the stomps. There was nothing on the 4th floor except the main office. I tried to rationalize what I was hearing. Maybe it was an employee who forgot something in the office. Maybe they were wearing headphones and couldn't hear me, or somehow the alarm they set off. I rounded the corner in the hallway and walked to the office door. The lights in the office are automatic. If anyone had walked in, they would be on, but they were off. I tried the door anyway and found that it was locked, as it should be. What the hell is happening, I thought. I began moving back to the stairs when the alarm sounded again. I ran to the elevator and checked the display, which showed that the alarm was from the 3rd floor east entrance. I bounded down the stairs and sprinted across the main lobby of the building. I crashed through the door and looked around, hoping to see who was messing with me. Nothing. I pulled the door shut, made sure it was locked, and made my way to the stairs. I almost jumped out of my skin when the alarm rang again. I ran back to the elevator and checked the display. It was the 3rd floor south entrance. My entrance. The fastest way to get there was to cut across the basketball court. However, the door was locked, since the school would use the 2 weeks when there was no one around to redo the court every year. Like most gym doors, if you pull hard enough, it opens, so I ripped the door open and, as fast and lightly as I could, ran across the court toward my entrance. I rushed through the door and was standing in the faculty parking lot. There was nothing there except my car. By now, I was freaked out and more than a little pissed off. I decided to head back to my office, call campus security, and tell them someone was in the building setting off alarms and giving me the runaround. I stomped down the 1st flight of stairs, muttering curse words to myself. I hit the landing, turned the corner, and a man who at that moment seemed to be 8 feet tall ducked down, got right in my face, and said, "Hello." He then walked past me, up the stairs, and out the door. If he had turned and looked back before pushing the door open, he would have seen me, leaning against the brick wall, arms spread to my side, gripping the wall for support, with what I can only imagine would have been a terrified look on my face. After what seemed like an hour but was most likely only seconds, I peeled myself off the wall and went to my office. I locked the door behind me, sat in my chair, and tried to figure out what the hell just happened. I don't really know how long I sat there, but it was long enough that my wife sent me a text asking why I wasn't home yet. I gathered my things and went up the stairs. I stopped at the door. A vision flashed before me of the large man I'd seen leaning against my car, waiting for me, The relief I felt when I opened the door and found an empty parking lot was one of the most amazing feelings I've ever had. As I drove away, I looked for the man everywhere, but I couldn't find him. To this day, I have 1,000 questions about that day. How he got in, how he went from the 4th floor to the 3rd without me seeing him, etc. That I don't think I'll ever figure out. So this story happened to me last year in New Mexico. For some background, I'd recently moved from New England to this dusty old Wild West state. I didn't have a job lined up, I didn't have a car or anything, so I basically took the first job I was offered. This job ended up being a sign-holding job. I know, so glamorous, but it was literally a 5-minute walk from my house. The job was weird from the get-go. The town is a weird and dying one, and it was the summer, and my boss was a very attitude-filled chain smoker who basically cracked the door open, stood by it, and smoked all day. Anyway, I usually had random people scream things at me. I had people come up to me and flirt. I've also had someone try to shove food in my mouth. Oh, and I was asked out by a random person who I never saw again. Not to mention the neighborhood drunk always stopped to talk to me. So I was pretty used to weirdness. I just took it and moved on, and didn't dwell on it too much. And that all changed when one day this Dodge Charger pulled in right behind me. I was an idiot that day. I wasn't being observant as I usually was, and as I was taught. I was tired of standing on my feet. It was over 100 degrees and I was hungry. At first I didn't even hear the guy or the car. I had my earphones in, jamming to Guns N' Roses, AC/DC, and Ozzy. And then I felt somebody behind me, and I spun around to be faced with this super tall man that had a vibe of danger. My first response was to back up, but I curbed it and just smiled at him and asked if I could help him. He asks me for my name, which I stupidly gave, and then he asks me these questions. Do you prefer diamonds, rubies, or sapphires? Do you prefer the couch or the bed? Shoes or no shoes? Favorite color? Do you have a man? At the time I didn't, but I answered yes. Well, I don't see a ring on your finger. He should be all over you, making you his... And then it gets weirder. Can you believe it? Will you go out with me? I can treat you better. I calmly and firmly said no. And well, he wasn't too keen on that. He stared at me coldly for a few seconds, and then he smiled, got into his car, and looked back at me. I'll be back for you, every day until you say yes to me. Usually I would laugh off and roll my eyes, but this guy was dangerous. An expensive car, nice watch, and expensive clothes in this particular dying town. I'm thinking drug dealer. I can't be sure, but that's really the only explanation. I quit the next day. I wasn't about to take a chance. From then on, I either always carried pepper spray or a knife on me. And now I have a boyfriend who wholeheartedly believes in the Second Amendment. Thank God I haven't seen the guy since, but the thing is, how do I know he hasn't seen me? Obligatory, I created a Reddit account just to share this story. This happened a few hours ago, and I'm still a little shaken up. I don't think I'll be able to sleep tonight. I feel the need to talk about what happened. A little background. My mom owns a boutique which has been going strong for 5 years now. Tonight was her anniversary party, which was held at the store. Quite a few of her friends and employees were there, just having a good time. Being a 17-year-old male, I didn't want to spend all day in a boutique. I spent the day with some friends and left just as it began to get dark. I decided to stop by the shop party and say hi to my mom and her friends. On the way over there, I noticed it was a full moon. That turns out to be quite the coincidence, since everyone says full moons bring out the weirdos. I enter the store and everything's going great. My mom's laughing with her friends. One of my buddies is actually there playing guitar for them. His dad is there as well, who I also get along with. I began talking to my mom's friends who were asking me all the usual questions that friends of parents ask. I was actually having a pretty good time. And then a large man who looked to be in his 20s came in. He was well-dressed, clean-cut, and appeared to be in a good mood. My first thought was that he's here to buy something for a girlfriend. He goes to a group of my mom's friends and casually asks, "Are there any demons in here?" Everyone looks at him, obviously puzzled. "What?" someone asks. A little louder, he says, I'm looking for demons. Are you demons? My mom and a couple of her friends approached him, but I couldn't fully hear what they were saying. In a smart-ass tone, the man yells, "Should I call you demons, or should I call you bitches?" That's when my mom and her group snapped back, demanding he leave. Are you kicking me out? Am I not welcome here? He keeps repeating those questions. My mom didn't back down. She just kept looking straight up into this guy's eyes. Adrenaline kicked in. I started fearing for my mom's safety. I was carrying my pocket knife, and somehow my brain decided it was too short to do any real damage. At this point, I'm already moving towards them. On my way, I notice a large liquor bottle, which I instinctively arm myself with. I'm coming up on his side, but one of my mom's friends, Amy, is between us. I reach my arm around her and try to move her out of the way. She doesn't budge and starts trying to calm me down. The man is still going at it with my mom, calling her a bitch and threatening her. He kept saying things like, "I'm going to have to come back here and finish this." Even though Amy is still between us, I have a clear shot at the guy. The bottle was very round and didn't have a long enough neck to use as a handle, so I cocked it back as best as I could, about to slam it on his head. And then someone yells, "Oh my God, Tourette's Texan's gonna hit him." I freeze. He turns and faces my direction, but strangely not at me. "Who's Tourette's Texan? I want to see Tourette's Texan." He repeated those questions several times. Then my mom starts calling out for me to come over, though there was no fear in her voice. I prepared my arm for a second attempt at a strike, but several of my mother's friends got in between us. Somehow, Barbara, one of my mom's friends, started calmly talking to the guy. They started talking about Jesus, and he yells, "Jesus is a girl." Barbara responded with, "All right, sorry, God bless you." He seemed to get annoyed and said, "It's Jehovah. Jehovah bless me." "Okay, sorry. Jehovah bless you." "I am Jehovah." She got him to walk out of the store with her. Adrenaline and panic filled me, and I tried to follow them, since I was still intent on smashing the bottle over his head. But Barbara turned around and told me to stay inside, so I did. I stood there and looked out the glass door as she talked him down. Eventually they hugged, and he walked off into the night. My mom called the area's security guard, and he came to the shop almost instantly. We told him what happened, and he went out and did a quick search for him. He didn't find him. He told us, "All the weird ones come out this time of year." That's when I mentioned the full moon. After that, everything went back to normal. Truth be told, I was pretty shaken up. Still am, obviously. I found a hammer under the counter and sat it by the door the rest of the night. Whenever one of the women would leave, I'd escort them out to their car and make sure they left safe. I keep going over what happened in my mind, even though I know the situation ended perfectly. No one hurt and there was no physical contact. I keep regretting not hitting the guy. I take martial arts, but I'm pretty lightweight. This guy was a lot bigger than me, so I know it's stupid of me to want to have initiated a fight with him. It's just hard hearing someone call your mom a bitch and threaten her right in front of you. I'm just glad I was there to help. The weird thing was, he appeared perfectly sober. I'm almost positive that he has a mental illness and was off his meds. I've volunteered to go up to the shop during the evenings and sit with whoever's working. I guess I'll update this if anything else happens. No, I hope it doesn't. This incident took place when I was in 8th standard. I used to go for Hindi tuitions, which were about 15 minutes walking distance away from my house. I was 12 years old, and I had this thought that I was old enough to travel alone. I know, I was just 12, but come on, it was only 15 minutes and I had a phone so I could contact my parents in case of an emergency. However, it took time convincing my parents that I would be alright on my own. Initially, they resisted, so my mom hired a maid to drop and pick me up from classes. I believed myself to be an independent person then, and decided to fire the maid myself politely after a few months of irregularity, as I used to get late for classes. My parents were shocked, but cool with it after some convincing. It was one such day after I began traveling alone. I was on time and waiting for the lift at the ground floor. Had to go up to the 8th floor. On entering the lift, I was just about to close the door when I saw a man in his 20s waving at a distance. He was waving at me to stop the lift as he wanted to get in and was a little distance away. At first I decided to ignore, but then I figured, what harm would it do letting him share the lift? Plus, I had my phone. He soon got in, thanked me, and tried to strike up a conversation. I knew I shouldn't, but I encouraged it. He asked me where I was going and all. Also, it was just 8 floors, but the lift was super slow, as it was an old building. The man looked in pain. At about the 2nd floor, he asked me whether there was a doctor in the building, but I didn't know. He started hissing in pain and brought down his pants and underwear, exposing his penis. And that was the first time I ever saw a penis. He started muttering to himself that it was painful in Hindi and started rubbing it. I was stuck there for a few seconds. I couldn't get out as it was a moving lift, and I was scared to abruptly stop it. I kind of panicked inside, didn't know what to do, so I stayed calm on the inside, staring at my nails. After what felt like an eternity, he got off at the 6th floor. I was so relieved. I haven't told this to anybody. I tried telling a friend, but couldn't. I feared traveling in that lift again, but had no choice. I know most of you are thinking it's just a normal encounter and that nothing happened to me, but guys, I was 12. Born and brought up in a protected society where talking about such things is a taboo, and it was a sudden shock to me. Anyway, I'm thankful that it only lasted a few seconds, but I was so terrified and embarrassed at that moment. The poor guy probably didn't care that I was in the lift, considering his pain in the penis. I had a bad childhood. Being in a horrid situation I'd rather not discuss this time, but around 2004 or 2005, my mother and I had gotten to a women's shelter in the Bible Belt of America. I was a nearly 5-year-old boy who was used to moving around, even in such an adolescent state of mind, and to get some money within our first month there, we had to sell my mother's car and sold it to an early 30s Oriental man. The man seemed normal at the time, but as the weeks went by, we would see him more and more, my mother not thinking the worst yet. Later, we figured out that he lived across the street from the shelter, and looking back, this gave him the means to prey on women and their children in their worst times, which is all the worst, given I have faint memories of him being near my therapist's building, although I could be mistaken. I helped my grandmother at the farmer's market when I wasn't in school, as much as a 5 or 6-year-old could, and so it was normal for me to be semi-unattended on and off throughout the day, normally roaming the market and speaking to family friends who also worked there. During one of these strolls in the market, I saw that man, the one we'd sold the vehicle to, looking at me, and then suddenly walking towards me, and kneeling down, he said something that haunts me to this day because of the many implied situations that could have occurred. He asked, "Do you want to go to China?" Luckily, I was a faithful child to my parents' permission and told him I'd need to ask them first. He then darted away from me, and within minutes my father was chasing him with a baseball bat, but never caught up, and he was never reported to the police as to not start any trouble, as the state we lived in had many gangs who were and still are known for how they deal with trouble. This happened during the summer of 2004. I lived with my husband and children in a small town about 50 miles outside a major city. My town is relatively quiet without much crime, but we do get the occasional break-in or other petty crime. I should also note that my area seems to get many door-to-door salesmen and church groups, but I generally considered it more annoying than anything menacing. It was around 10 a.m. when I was home alone, cleaning the house and listening to music, Metallica. I had my front window open that faces my front door as we don't have central air and it was pretty hot that day. Someone knocks on my door and I look through the window to see a girl I would guess is in her early 20s standing there. She has a clipboard and pen in her hand. I assume she's selling something. I turn off my music and open the door, ready to tell her I'm not interested. She immediately hands me a laminated card with a list of magazines she's selling. I'm holding this card, not really reading it, and was about to hand it back to her when I flip the card over and see written in red pen, "This girl is crazy. Do not let her in your house." I'm shitting bricks when I read this, and I'm about to slam the door on her when she says, "I love Metallica. Turn it back on." She pushed her way past me and sat down on my couch in my living room, which is about 5 feet away from my front door. I'm still standing in the doorway of my living room in utter shock. I just stare at her for 5 to 10 minutes before I find my voice. I tell her she needs to leave now. She lit up a cigarette and walks over to my stereo to turn the music back on. By this point, I'm completely freaking out and walk to my kitchen and grab my phone to call the police. She ran out the door before I could even dial. I live 2 blocks away from the police station, and they're there in less than 5 minutes. Long story short, they aren't able to find her, but tell me that they've gotten complaints about someone that fits her description from other people in the area as well. A neighbor down the block told me she came to her door too. She didn't try to go in her house, but she was super pushy and kept saying odd things like, "Let's go shopping sometime," and other nonsense. So, creepy magazine salesgirl and Metallica fan, let's not meet again. I remember something strange happening to me one night back in 2012, and didn't know where else to put it, but recently learned about this subreddit. I was sitting in my house early fall, playing video games. My mom and brother went to bed. My dad is still at work and should be coming home. I hear the doorbell ring. It was roughly 11 p.m. I thought, oh, it must be my dad. Probably couldn't get into the garage. I paused my game to get the door, but since I was unsure, I looked through the peephole. Around the corner is a street lamp and my porch light wasn't on, so all I could make out was a dark figure. It wasn't my dad. My dad's a pot-bellied 5'10" man, and this figure was thinner and shorter. I'm staring out for what felt like an eternity. The figure rings the doorbell again and knocks. By this time, I realized the door was unlocked and immediately locked the door. The handle rattles and I let out a gasp. I run into the living room to get my cell phone and start dialing the non-emergency line. I look out the peephole, and it's gone. To my north is the cul-de-sac I live on. The houses are spread out and it's reasonably lit. To the east and south is an open space with another well-lit road, and west is a highway and a neighbor. My house has a ton of windows and is on a slight incline. I essentially can see if someone comes into the cul-de-sac, people walking down the roads, people in the open space, etc. There's little to nothing obscuring my view. Now at this point, I'm thinking it's my unstable and abusive ex. My ex didn't have his license, lived 3 miles away to the south, and mainly traveled by bike. I broke up with him a couple of months beforehand, but he stopped bothering me. I looked out all the windows facing the cul-de-sac, the open space, and towards all the roads. I looked out the peephole again. Nothing. I sat back down in the living room, but had a really bad feeling, like my hair was standing up. After about 30 minutes of Minecraft, I turned off the lights and went to bed. The next morning, I opened the front door to get the mail and found a handful of purple petunias there. My mom and I didn't grow petunias. I walked up the street to get my mail. My neighbors didn't grow petunias either. I came back to my house and saw that our fence to the backyard was wide open. I grabbed a 2x4 and walked back there, finding more scattered petunias all the way up to the patio door. The patio door looked into the living room where I was playing video games and had forgot to close the curtains. To understand some of what happened in this story, I have to give a small amount of backstory. I'm a female college student, only 5'3" tall, same height I've been since middle school, and 112 pounds at my heaviest. I was 17 years old when this occurred, and I'm 19 now. However, I always seem to look younger than I am. Most people think I'm 14 or 15. Though I had never been creeped on before this incident, it's been pointed out to me before that my small build, young age, and even younger appearance makes me look like a victim. One last thing you readers have to understand about me is that I, at a very young age, was diagnosed with PDD-NOS, an autism spectrum disorder. Among my symptoms are struggling to read facial expressions, tones of voice, and body language, facial blindness, meaning I struggle to remember faces, and some hypersensitivities to sound. The latter symptom doesn't normally bother me terribly much, but I do like to keep headphones on or earbuds in whenever I can to block out sounds other than music. The incident in question began barely a few weeks into the beginning of my senior year of high school. I had a 0 period, so every day I would have to be at my school and in my class by 7 in the morning. The catch was that I had to walk, as my mother was the only one with a car and never had time to drive my 2 sisters and I to school. I would usually leave the house by 6:30 at the latest, and I always went alone since my sisters didn't have a 0 period like I did. And, being that it was autumn, it was very dark in the mornings. Even in a relatively safe, though rather large, town such as the one I lived in, this was a recipe for trouble. Every morning on my way to school, I would have to walk past a small set of houses beside an Arco gas station. The middle of the 3 houses was the home of a Hispanic mustached man who would always sit on his porch in the morning and watch me walk by, even when I chose to walk across the street from him. I'm a terrible judge of age, but I believe he may have been somewhere in his 50s. But, regardless of age, I always felt that he had no business watching me every morning, and, unfortunately, it wasn't just in the morning that he watched me. Every afternoon when I walked home, he would again sit on his porch and watch. He watched other kids as well, but his gaze always seemed to pick me out, even in a thick crowd. It creeped me out, but not enough to warrant me telling my mother or grandmother, whom I call Nana. Perhaps due to my autism, I somehow wound up believing that his behavior might not be that strange. I was, after all, aware of the fact that people reading wasn't a skill of mine, so I just tried to ignore it. This continued on for months, with nothing of great importance occurring. I walked, and he watched. That was it. Until, that is, around early January. One day, I was walking to school in the early morning again. Some jerks in my neighborhood had begun popping off fireworks in spite of the early hour and the fact that the New Year's holiday was in the past. I didn't like the loud popping noises, so I put my headphones on and turned on a flute song. The sound of the wooden flute soothed me, and I turned the volume up loud enough that I could drown out the fireworks a bit without deafening myself. Because of the loud music, I didn't hear the creeper man when he, for the first time ever, tried to speak to me as I walked past. I don't know if this angered him or not, but it did prompt him to walk over and lay a hand on my shoulder. Since another of my symptoms is an aversion to being touched, save for under certain circumstances with certain people, I immediately recoiled from the man. The swift movement, combined with the way I jumped, was enough to cause my headphones to slip off my head and around my neck. Almost as soon as they did so, I turned to the man and he, for whatever reason, smiled at me. "I spoke to you, sweetheart. Guess you didn't hear me." There was a small pause, then he asked, "What are you listening to?" I didn't say a word back to him for several reasons. 1, I was startled. 2, I was well aware of the concept of stranger danger, and didn't like speaking to new people anyway. 3, I didn't think the answer to his question was, well, any of his business. 4th, and finally, I didn't want to waste time and end up being late for school. So, instead of replying, I simply turned and resumed walking to school. Nothing further happened that day, apart from the man's usual staring, and I didn't tell my mom or Nana. However, my ordeal wasn't through yet. The events of that day ushered in a new period of creepiness, with him now trying to speak to me every single time I passed his house, even when there were well over 100 other people around. But, because I could never really read him, I could never quite tell if he was just being overly friendly or if he was genuinely being a creeper. It bothered me, but I still didn't tell anyone, and things only escalated from there. Around March, I was genuinely stalked for the first time. I walked past the man's house one morning, as I always had to do when walking to school, and he suddenly got off of his plastic chair, stepped off of his porch, and walked beside me. He stayed there the whole way, only leaving when I reached school. This, of course, freaked me out, but one aspect of it didn't. There was only one high school in the whole town, large though said town was, so I figured he would know my school either way. Still, him following me did finally scare me enough to consider speaking about it, but of course, I was a fool and didn't. Instead, I did something I've learned to do over the years to express myself, which is something I struggle with. I wrote. By the end of May, I had filled a good couple of pages with small snippets and journal entries where I vented about my encounters with the man. During that time, he'd accompanied me to school nearly every other day, and had put his hand on my shoulders and arms multiple times. He always seemed to enjoy the way I jumped, and would smile every time I would try to glare. Then, about a week into April, he got creepier. He walked with me to school again, despite my attempts to get him to leave, and talked the whole way. At one point, he told me quite suddenly, "You're special, sweetheart, I can tell. My niece is a lot like you. She's special too. I like special girls." I had no idea what he really meant by that last comment, but something about it freaked me out enough to prompt me to sprint the rest of the way to school, textbook-laden backpack in tow. And I was no track star, but I was fast enough to lose him. He made chase, but thankfully stopped once I was within the school's gates. After that, he simply walked away. Still, my journal entry for the day was quite creepy in comparison to the rest. This is where my wonderful Nana comes in. My Nana's a hard woman to live with for many reasons, one of those reasons being that she was and still is a very nosy woman. Barely 3 or 4 days after the man made that special girls comment to me, my Nana happened upon my nondiscreet spiral notebook and journal sitting in the desk in my room, which one had to pass through to get to the backyard. Having never seen it before, she promptly picked it up, opened it, and read its contents. Its secrets revealed, my normally grouchy but also very protective and loving grandmother freaked out, called my mom, and the two of them picked me up after school that day. One would think that this sort of incident would have been reported to the local police, right? Well, that didn't happen. The reason for this is that the cops in the town genuinely don't care about doing their duties unless they think weapons are involved in the crimes taking place, which often leads me to wonder how the town stays as generally safe as it is. A prime example of their lack of care was when my sister was stalked and harassed by some large teenage boys on the way home from school once. The police said she'd probably somehow provoked them, and that nothing could be done. My mom never really forgave the local cops for that. There was only around 10 of them, nor did she ever regain trust in them. As such, the only change that occurred was that she and my Nana helped me work out a new route for me to get to school and back home, as I struggle with learning streets and the like, and my Nana promised me to pick me up in the afternoons whenever she could. Nothing else really happened after that. I avoided the man successfully, and life went on. The only other thing relating to this incident that ever came up was a rumor. The rumor was that, supposedly, the man who had stalked me to and from school was a known pedophile. I never learned if that was true or not, and I moved away from that town with my whole family that August. The chances of my ever seeing that man again are slim, and I'm very glad. I mentioned at the top of this post that I struggle with facial blindness, but forgot to explain why this is relevant. The reason why it's important to the story is because, even pretending the cops had cared about the stalker man, I likely wouldn't have been able to tell them anything more than what house he lived in and that he had a mustache. And, of course, that may not have helped if there were other mustached men living with him. So needless to say, there probably still wouldn't have been much of anything done by the police in that case. In 2012, I was living in Rome for the summer. My apartment was very close to the Colosseum, but I was working as an undergraduate visiting researcher at the university. Every day I would walk to and from work, which took about 35 to 40 minutes. One evening, I decided to take an alternative route that would shave off some time from my walk. Normally, I would have went through the main terminal where all the people and shops are. This new route, however, had me cross the tracks further down from the actual station. As I got closer to the tracks, I noticed the area began to look really rough and that there were a lot of homeless people hanging around. I power walked through it and just avoided eye contact with everyone and eventually reached a small traffic tunnel. About halfway through, I felt someone come up behind me. He smelled terrible and was almost certainly foreign, as his Italian had a very, very thick accent, and plus he didn't look Italian. My Italian also wasn't very good at that point, and I couldn't really understand what he was saying, so I said, "Despias, non parlo italiano." The guy still wouldn't stop talking to me, even though he knew I couldn't understand what he was saying. I just assumed he really wanted money or something, but would go away on his own when he figured out I wasn't going to give him any. We reached the end of the tunnel, and I was doing my best to just ignore him. I looked around and noticed the streets were abandoned, even though it was just after rush hour. I turned to him at some point and said, "Basta," stop, or that's enough, but he just kept following me and talking. I began to get nervous, but because he wasn't doing anything really threatening, I wasn't overly worried. When I reached a small stoplight, the guy's hand reached down and tugged at the bottom of my dress and sort of started to lift it. At this point, I felt threatened and swung my bag at him, which made him stagger a little. It was enough for me to take off in a bit of a sprint. However, I noticed when I looked back the guy was still following me, just now at a small distance. I kept jogging until I finally reached a small grocery store and ran inside. The guy was right at my heels. At this point, he was directly behind my back, so close I could feel his body heat. He then started reaching for my elbow like he was going to drag me out of the store. I shoved him off again and ran up to two other girls who were by the produce and seemed to be around my age, asking if they spoke English. When they said yes, I motioned to the guy behind me and told them that the man had been following me since the train tracks. The girls' faces turned pretty serious at that point, and they started speaking rapidly to the guy in Italian. They then turned back to me and asked whether I knew him and told me he was saying he was my boyfriend and that we'd just been in a fight and I was lying. I told them I never met him before and had no idea who he was. I'd say the fact that he couldn't speak English and that my Italian was limited to telling people I couldn't speak Italian and asking for the bathroom made them certain that there was little way this guy actually knew me. One of the girls then left to get the manager, who promptly threw the man out and told me he was watching on the monitors to make sure he went away. After the manager realized the man wouldn't go away, and having him attempt to re-enter the store about half an hour later, he called the police. The police arrived and I told them my story. By that point, the guy seemed to have finally left, probably scared off when he saw the police coming. The manager then gave me a ride back to my apartment so the guy couldn't follow me just in case he was still lurking around. Luckily, that was the end of that, and I never walked past the train tracks again. I think I got lucky to have found the store, but it still taught me a very valuable lesson about being careful about the areas you venture into in new cities. Now I ask the locals for areas to avoid, instead of wandering around foreign cities on my own. When I was 17 and freshly graduated from high school, my aunt gave me the gift of a lifetime. She flew me and my older cousin Stephanie to Europe. We started in Madrid, Spain. We drove from there to Almeria, Marbella, and then Seville. We were only staying in Seville for a short time because we had to get back to Madrid to fly out to Dublin, Ireland. Seville is much more Spanish than the other larger cities we visited. From what I say, it was way less touristy. Anyway, even though I'm 17, literally no one IDs me. Being a woman is awesome. Now, I'm fairly short, 5'2" on a good day, and at the time, 140 pounds. I was cute, pale with dark curly hair, and for my age, fairly large-breasted. We got to Seville around dark. We checked into a hotel, ate at a local pub, and then decided to walk around town to a local Irish pub. The bar ended up being somewhere my aunt's boyfriend at the time worked, and the staff were awesome. They were giving us drinks on the house and making us specialized drinks to try. My aunt and her boyfriend went off to find some other places and take pictures. My cousin was eating some dude's face. Well, after getting fairly smashed, my cousin, graceless as she is, starts puking everywhere, including on the side of a church. Now, I'm drunk as a skunk, but she's so drunk she's literally no help. I have a little map that the hostel gave us, but I'm too drunk to notice it's upside down. We start walking back in the general direction of where I know the hotel is. My cousin is crying and falling down and puking in gutters, and I'm doing my best to keep her up with me. I take a left down a street and notice a guy on a bicycle. Now, I'm a shy type person and don't ever talk to strangers, but my cousin is literally sobbing and puking on the sidewalk, and there's no one around, so I flag down bicycle guy. He's really nice, has decent English, and I show him the map that shows him where my hostel is. He laughs and told me I took a left instead of a right, so I drag my cousin to her feet and we start heading back the way we came. I thank the guy and keep walking, but he starts walking with us. He starts talking to me, asking how old I am, where I'm from, etc. He was being fairly friendly, so I obliged, told him I was with family and we were on vacation, etc. My cell phone rang and my aunt was calling to ask where we were. We were literally down the street from where the hostel was, and my cousin just fucking runs off and leaves me there with some stranger. I kind of stutter goodbye and turn to leave, but he grabs me and fucking plants one right on my mouth. Luckily, my aunt was coming towards us down the street, and once he let me go, I stuttered goodbye and just ran off towards my family. If it ended there, it'd have been fine, but like 2 hours later, that same guy shows up at the hostel. He's drunk as shit, and this is a high-class hostel, so they turn him away at the door. I only knew he was there because our room was close to the door, and he was literally screaming for me. The next day when we're packing to leave, that guy showed up. My aunt's boyfriend is no small dude. He's at least 6'2" and 200 pounds easy, so when he saw this guy eyeing me, he took him aside and had words with him. It was scary because he was so violent and hostile about trying to see me when he'd been so nice the night before. I don't know what would have happened if my aunt hadn't been walking down the street. Would he have let me go? I can't remember my age at the time exactly, but this was during my danger whore years, so anywhere between 16 and 20. One of my close friends sweet-talked me into fishing with her on the social media website Tagged. I was cute, 5'2", big hazel eyes, double D's, and all the innocence and naivety of a child. I was like an instant cult classic. I received hundreds of messages daily. Most of them were the "let me see your tits" variety, but some people actually put in effort. It was those that tended to put effort in that I rewarded with conversation. I wasn't picky, and I ended up making friends with a much older guy, like late 40s, early 50s. He was nice. He wasn't pushy or weird. We talked for a while, and when he asked me for my cell number, I obliged. The texts were nice, not creepy or anything. He was from a small town like 45 minutes away. He asked if we could meet. I declined because he was so much older. Well, he kept pestering me about it, so I agreed, but he wanted to meet at a hotel at night and said he would buy booze. And I was kind of sketched out, but I agreed. I knew the city really well because I previously lived there, had tons of friends and adults I could contact, so I guess I felt okay about it. I met him. He was nice, but he seemed so old. I didn't drink anything, but he was already drunk when I got there. He tried to kiss me, but I declined, and he respected that. I only stayed a little and left. It was a long drive home, after all. I decided that even though he was nice, he obviously had the wrong impression, and I told him we couldn't be friends anymore. He flipped out. He would text me constantly, calling me names and degrading me, saying I was stupid and he would take care of me. At this point, I told my mom, who called our phone company and got his number blocked. When he realized I wouldn't text him back, he started blowing up my Tagged account. The creepiest message I ever got from him was from a song, AO Technology by Milo. It's a much more intense, intimate version of the pop version. I told him to stop and deleted my Tagged profile. Now, when I'd met him, he'd pointed his car out to me because he was apparently so super proud of it. It was a Honda hatchback style painted purple with flames on the side. Totally lame. My bedroom at the time was an old family room converted. It was during summer and it was hot. I always kept the window open and the blinds raised halfway. My dog liked to sit there. I had a coffee table for him in front, and while he's prone to bark at any damn thing, he actually growled. That alone freaked me out, but when I got to the window, I saw someone dodging around the side of the house towards the fenced yard. Kids cut across our lawn a lot because we're the corner house, but I saw that ugly-ass car drive around the corner. I flipped and called for my mom. She called the cops, but they said there was nothing they could do. Luckily, after that incident, nothing else happened, but it taught me a great lesson about social media cesspools. I caught myself looking over my shoulder a lot more to make sure I never saw him. I also quit frequenting the small town because I was afraid I'd run into him. I'm a female. Colombian, 29 years old, athletic, and adventurous. I enjoy traveling, walking, hiking, and camping. This happened about 6 years ago. In one of these trips, I was with my ex-boyfriend and our 2 dogs. He had a crossbreed brown lab-looking dog, and mine is a golden retriever. Not scary dogs at all, but certainly big and with powerful barks. We always went walking with them on trails and exploring around the city limits, but this time, he'd heard about this river in the middle of the mountains with a huge cascade that seemed to be out of this world. The place was described to him by his college mates, and it sounded beautiful, so we assumed it would be a fun way to spend our Sunday morning and early afternoon. We packed simple bags with sandwiches, snacks, water, and beer, and off we went. Once we made it to the beginning of the trail, the dogs seemed impatient. They were very active when they were together, so we assumed they just wanted to run, and we let them loose. The mountain started out in a very steep way. We pretty much had to climb along sharp rocks for about 15 minutes before we could reach the actual trail. Keep in mind that Colombia is nothing like the United States. Our wild areas are actually wild. No trails designated, no forest rangers, no watchtowers, nothing of that sort. Once you're out of the city limits, you're pretty much on your own, and there's certainly no cops or anything around these areas. They're highly underpopulated and overall deserted. Once we reached the trail, we noticed that it was hardly visible to see it. Trails are usually patches of the forest that are not as prominent, so you can see somewhat of a trail left, but it was made by people or animals walking around, so it gets very faint sometimes, and many times you don't see it or have no idea where to go. This trail was like that, which we actually liked, because that meant there'd be no people around bothering us, and we could smoke and enjoy the river on our own. We got excited and kept walking through the almost invisible trail. A little ways down, we started hearing branches break, voices, and a little bit of laughter. We looked at each other with disappointment because we wanted to be alone, and these sounds clearly indicated that we were not. We kept walking and then saw some colors and shapes through the bushes. They stopped as well and saw us. The elderly man waved, and he was getting closer. His wife walked behind, but was holding him from his elbow. They walked slowly as we exchanged pleasantries about the day and what a nice day to hike sort of thing. When they reached us, he looked up at us as he was petting the dogs and said, "You guys heading back?" To which we responded with, "No, actually we just got started. We wanted to reach the waterfall in the mountain over there." He looked at where I was pointing and frowned. I found it odd, and then he replied, "You guys should be careful. I hear a lot of stories about people getting lost in these parts, or even worse. You're better off heading back with us." We both thought the old man was just being a wet blanket, and we were somewhat experts in trails, hiking, camping, and living on the edge, so my ex said, "Nah, we'll be fine. We have these 2 beasts to protect us," to which we all kind of chuckled. He then said, "Well, anyway, be very careful. And you, sweetheart, you should tuck in that little gold chain inside your shirt. You never know who's looking for that stuff to yank it off." I had yet to think about that, but I was wearing a little golden chain on my neck, except it wasn't golden. It was a 24-karat gold chain that was given to me by my godfathers when I was born. It was a tradition in my family that any time a baby was born, all the uncles, aunts, friends, and close family members gave us gold accents with different shapes and forms, as well as a chain to hang them all from. It's a Colombian thing, and it mostly ensures good luck for the new baby by presenting gold gifts as the three wise men did to Jesus. I had found the chain on my mom's safe during my last visit to her house and was wearing it ever since. No accents, though, just the chain. The accents were so many that they weighed a ton, but I liked the chain because it made me feel safe somehow. I grabbed it instinctively and tucked it inside my shirt collar. We exchanged goodbyes with the couple and went off. We were hiking for over an hour, stopping here and there to take pictures, drink water, or give the dogs a treat. Nothing weird until then, and we were almost at the mountain. We could faintly hear the waterfall. The next part of the way was rougher, though. We had to climb down this cliff, literally a cliff, and we didn't bring any gear, so we had to be extra careful with the dogs, but they did it rather quickly and with no hassle. While I was heading down, though, my ex was waiting for me at the base of the cliff with his dog. Mine had turned back to come down again with me, but she stopped at the top and stared at the woods before the cliff. She stared and then started growling. That's weird. My dog is by far the sweetest dog ever, and she never growls, but this time she seemed fierce. She kept growling more and more while I called for her. "Fermina! Fermina, come here!" She then looked at me almost halfway down the cliff and then back at the woods, and then back at me again and started heading down. She would stop every now and then and stare at the woods, but eventually got down with me and we kept walking. The mountains have created a natural junction with water falling from the very top to a clear pond at the bottom. The water was freezing cold and the noise was pretty intense. The dogs were beyond themselves. They started running, jumping, chasing each other, barking and swimming. We got off our clothes and jumped in as well. It was delicious. The cold water against the hot weather felt like heaven, and we were high by then, so the sensations were very strong. We kept playing in the water for a while. Then we got out and sat on the rocks to smoke some more. After a while, we heard the dogs barking, but not playfully like before. They were barking loud and menacingly. We looked at them, and they were both at the very edge of the pond, staring at the woods on the top of the mountain and barking. The fur on their backs was raised. They looked creepy. I called for Mina again, and my boyfriend did the same with Rebecca, but none of them flinched. Their paws were firm on the ground, grasping at it. Their barks were so loud that it was becoming unbearable. I got up and walked over there and grabbed Fermina by her torso, just kind of giving her a hug and pulling her towards me. She kind of snapped out of it and started licking me ferociously. I kept asking, "What's wrong, girl? What's wrong?" And she just whimpered, licked me, and then started going back and forth from the edge of the pond to where I was standing. She whimpered really loud. It was like crying, and I was getting scared. I said to my ex, "Screw it, I'm out of here. She's acting really weird." Rebecca, his dog, always barked at everything, so he wasn't concerned at all. He agreed and we started packing. And then I heard something. A whistle. It was definitely a human whistle. Sounded like a little melody. First a long one and then two short ones. I stopped dead on my track and tried to hear it again, over the barking in the waterfall, but couldn't hear it anymore. And I thought to myself, weirdest bird ever, and put my backpack on. We started walking back to the cliff again, and the dogs were getting worse. It was almost impossible to hear anything besides them barking and growling and Fermina whimpering by my side. I started climbing first. My ex was behind me, and the dogs made it to the top in no time and started barking again and growling at the woods. I kept telling Fermina to shut it, but she wouldn't, and then I finally made it to the top. One side had a huge drop of over 50 to 80 feet, and on the other, there was the woods. Tall pine trees and wild bushes everywhere made them look dense and deep. I urged my boyfriend to hurry, because the dogs were unbearable. And then I heard it. Branches breaking. The dogs got even more aggressive. They started running towards the edge of the forest, back and forth to where I was. I just stood there, staring as well. More branches. Now they were getting louder. I knew someone was there, and getting closer with each step. I kept trying to see past the tree line, but only saw green and brown and darkness. But then a figure started emerging from within. First I thought it was another couple, or maybe just a hiker like us. But this figure was moving weird, a little bit too heavy to be a hiker, and slowly, and had no backpack, but The hands were holding something in front of him. A shotgun? What is this? I freaked out. The dog started barking louder, and Rebecca almost jumped the guy when he came out of the woods. He was stocky, wearing a black jacket, shotgun pointed straight at me. I yelled at Rebecca, "Stop, come here," and she actually did, which is weird because she never listens. He then said, "Tell your boyfriend to come up," and I took just a couple steps back. I was almost on the edge of the cliff and stared down. My boyfriend was almost there, and he heard the voice of the man. He hurried up and climbed to where I was. I was standing there, petrified, unable to talk, just looking at the dark circle of the shotgun barrel. And then I got a glance of something shiny, something metal-looking. He had a machete hanging from his belt loop, just like that, a huge machete with rusty edges. I was beside myself, but I managed to grab my boyfriend's hand as he stood up on the top of the cliff and stared at the man. My ex was nothing less than scary. He was 6'8" and weighed over 200 pounds. His green eyes glared as he stared at the man, and then he said, "Take what you want and leave us." The noise the dogs were making was extreme. The guy looked at me and pointed the gun as he said, "Grab those dogs and shut them up or I'll shoot them both right here." I called them softly and grabbed Fermina by the collar. She started licking me and whimpering, scared and understanding what was going on. Rebecca was a little rascal, so I kind of crawled on the ground and grabbed her by the back leg. She then turned around and I grabbed her collar. I held them both close to me while I petted them, whispering, "Shh, it's okay, girl, it's okay," over and over. I was in tears by then, but my ex stood his ground and just kept glaring. I saw his fists and he had them tightly closed, as if he was going to punch the guy. Then the guy whistled. It was the same whistle I heard before, the long one and then two short ones. The weird bird. Two more figures began coming out of the woods on either side of him. One of them had a silver revolver. I don't know much about guns, so bear with me. And the other one was just standing there menacingly. He then said to my ex, "Don't try anything stupid, pretty boy." And they started getting closer. I actually thought of jumping off the cliff. But then what? Even if I made it alive, they could easily shoot me from a distance in the canyon underneath. We were trapped. He then said, "Give me the bags," to which we replied by taking them off and sliding them on the ground closer to them. And then he said, "Stand up," looking at me and pointing the gun. I could now see his face. He had sunspots all over and really bad acne. His eyes were dark and small, like a bird's eyes. His hair was greasy and covered with a dirty black beanie. A big round nose completed the look and gave him an almost comical appearance. There was nothing comical about the shotgun, though. I stood up, holding the collars of the dogs tight together, and he then said, not bad at all." He then turned to look at the guy with the revolver and said, "Bring me that gold chain." I kind of gasped when he said that, and the other guy started walking towards me. The dogs started pulling the leashes. He stopped and looked at them and the other guy and said, "I don't like these fuckers. Let's just get rid of them." I was full on crying by then and just said, "No, please. No, hold on, I'll get it for you." I took the leashes with one hand and with the other, yanked the chain off my neck and then turned and gave it to my ex. He grabbed it and stared at me. He knew how much it meant to me and my family, but it was either that or our lives. So he turned and walked towards the guy. He grabbed it quickly and went back to his position. The other guy then stared at us, and then back at his guys at his side and asked him, "Have you ever had your way with a spoiled little girl?" And they all laughed. I felt like throwing up. My ex looked even more angry now. He then said, "We don't have anything else. Please let us go." Then the guy quieted down and stated back, "You do have something else. I'm deciding whether or not to let you walk out of here with it." And then gave me a perverted look that made my skin crawl. My ex said, "Sure, you can have your way with her." In such a calm way I thought he was giving me away, but then added, "After you fucking cowards fight me one by one and beat me until I'm dead, 'cause that's the only way." They all laughed at this, loud chuckles, and then he said, "Nah, not worth it. I can just shoot you and be done with it," and then pointed the gun at him. I was in shock. I couldn't believe this is how our lives were going to end, massacred over a stupid gold chain. 1,000 thoughts were going through my head. I was shivering when I heard this really faint whistle, very far away. Same frequency as theirs, but it was definitely further away, at least 3 miles. It was faint, but I heard it, and they did too. The guy with the shotgun stopped laughing and stood still as if trying to listen better this way. And then the whistle was there again, but this time the first whistle was way longer, and all three of them started walking backwards, almost retracing their steps back to the woods, and then the guy said, "You two fuckers are in luck," and turned around and disappeared as fast as they showed up. My ex and I exchanged looks of astonishment and then vaulted out of there, running through the woods like maniacs. The dogs were rattled up and they also jumped and ran all the way down to the main road. We didn't stop, we didn't talk, we didn't even look back. We just ran and jumped and stumbled until we were in the first climb again, and then we looked back. I thought I saw something moving behind the tree line, but I brushed it off as I jumped down and called out to Fermina. We then started walking home at a slower pace this time, not excited anymore, thinking how we would enter the flat without any keys as they were in my backpack. I touched my neck. The yanking of the chain left a little red mark. And after all, it was solid gold. This happened back in 2014. I went out on a night out for Halloween during my first year of university. I was wearing high-heeled boots and a leather jacket. Over the course of the night, drunk me had taken them off and left them at our group's table due to being uncomfortable. By the end of the night, I'd practically danced my way to near sobriety, and I went to my group's table. However, they'd given up on the table, and my boots and jacket were nowhere to be seen. Someone had stolen them. Whatever. They weren't expensive, and I rarely wore them anyway. Now, however, I had to walk the 15 minutes back to my accommodation. I didn't have money for a taxi, so I thought I'd just walk slowly. I asked one guy, the asshole in the group that everyone hated, if he could just keep me company because he was tall. He laughed, said no, and walked off, dragging the only girl who was also shoeless with him. So I was walking alone, shoeless, in a busy city center, watching out for broken glass or anything else that was harmful and disgusting. Everyone else was so far ahead that I couldn't even see them, but I just kept going. I was halfway to my place when I was stopped by a Middle Eastern man. The city's very culturally diverse. He asked if I was okay, and I was grateful someone cared enough to make sure I was all right. He offered to help walk me home, so I accepted for at least part of the way. He was very kind and told me his name was Omar. He started saying how beautiful he thought I was and how lucky he was to have found me, which unsettled me slightly. Once I was around the corner from my place, I thanked Omar and said I'd walk the rest of the way on my own. He instantly looked offended. "Don't you want to invite me in for a cup of tea to thank me?" I told him no, because I don't know him. He kept hold of my wrist. "Well, can I have a kiss for helping you?" Again, I declined, and his grip tightened. "Well, do I get a hug for being your friend?" At this point, I just wanted him to let go, so I gingerly gave him a hug. He then grabbed me and tried to kiss me, but I pressed my lips together, and instead he just licked up my face. I finally get free and start walking away. He follows me. I speed up and so does he. I abandon my check for glass on the floor and begin sprinting, now terrified as I hear him running too. I get out my phone and call my friend Rob, who I beg to help me. Omar is no longer following me, but I needed someone to keep me safe. He agrees and gets to my flat not long after I do with a knife in case Omar was still there. I told the people in my group and they were mortified that they left me alone. I returned home for a week because I was so thoroughly shaken up. Now, on a night out, I make sure everyone is close by, so it doesn't happen again to me or anyone else. This story took place no more than 3 years ago. For a little background, I was with my then boyfriend from the UK as he'd come to visit me and my family in beautiful Colombia. We haven't seen each other for a while, so I decided to buy a couple of plane tickets and take him from one plane to another at the very next day of his arrival. I did a lot of research, since I wanted to show him a place that not even I knew, and that we could both explore together. I chose this set of islands near the west coast of the country and at least 10 hours away from my hometown. The plan was to get off the plane, take a cab to a small coastal town, and from there take a boat to the chosen island. We made it to the small regional airport on time, took our bags, and started asking around where we could take the cab that would take us to our next stop. We found a cab service that took us along with other people in a van, and after a couple of hours made it to the small fishing town. After getting off the van, we noticed that the sun was setting and no boat will take us to the island at that time, so we decided to find a cheap hotel and sleep for the night. After walking around asking in different hotels, we chose the cheapest one. It was a little gross, but we didn't care. We were all about the island that waited ahead. On the next day, after a delicious yet humble breakfast, we took our bags to the port, found a boat, and it took us to the little island we wanted to go to. Our time in the island was lovely. We were almost alone, and stayed at an eco-friendly hotel that took our breath away. The white sand beaches were clean since no more than 50 tourists were at the island at the time, and most of them locked inside a 5-star hotel that we found walking down the shore. After 5 magical days on this beautiful paradise, we were heading back. Money was running low now, and since I was the one paying for almost everything on this trip, I was struggling to keep up. We made it back to the fishing town somehow, and we still have one more day left. We searched again for a nicer hotel this time, somewhere we could actually shower and relax, and then got bored indoors. It was just too hot to stay inside, so we decided to go explore. This town was small in comparison with other Colombian cities or towns, but at the same time, quite overpopulated. More than 2,000 people lived there, and even though they all knew each other, it still felt a little crowded. The beaches in this town were not as nice as the islands, especially because the sand was dark. The ocean had brown and green-colored waters, and it was dirty, since the amount of tourists from the other small town nearby was at an all-time rise. We didn't want to bathe in those waters, and started asking around where we could go for a nicer beach nearby. Many people agreed that there was this beach called La Playa del Francis. Translated, it's something like the French guy's beach, and apparently it was cleaner, solitary, and romantic. We didn't need to hear any more. We took a simple bag with our phones, sunblock, water, towel, wallets with money, and the hotel key. I was wearing this bag as a crossbody since it was an ethnic kind of bag we use in Colombia called mochila, and it's basically one big bowl of fabric with a strap sewn or cut on opposite sides. It has no way to close up, so imagine you wearing a grocery bag but the straps are just one and it's way longer. We started walking. The sun was scorching and the sand felt like burning even through our flip-flops. I gotta admit, I was excited about exploring, but at the same time, many people warned us to be careful, that there were a lot of alleged robberies in the area. But this is an everyday thing in my country, so I didn't pay it any mind. Every time I saw a guy or group of guys, my heart would flutter. It's like having tiny little panic attacks every time you see a face coming out of the dirt roads. This was a very poor town, so I wasn't concerned about the people who looked raggedy and dirty. However, my heart fluttered here and there when I saw people, especially once the tourist area started fading out in the background and we just kept walking towards the port and more empty beaches. We noticed the sand getting cleaner, less trash, and also less people. We saw this group of guys talking and they stopped as they saw us and stared. I tried to remain calm and tried to look as if I wasn't scared out of my mind and asked with my strongest voice, "Excuse me, do you know how far the French guy's beach is from here?" One of them scoffed and replied, "You're a ways far. Maybe you should take a cab or motorcycle." We didn't want to spend yet more money on unnecessary expenses. I had already started using my cards since I was out of cash, so I just looked at him and said, "All right, thanks. We'll keep walking and see what happens." We uncomfortably waved and kept walking. We noticed that as soon as we left, they did also, and were talking between themselves, but it wasn't possible to hear what they were saying as they were walking in the opposite direction. We kept walking through the beach. We saw the port coming up to us, and the beach in that area was closed. We were forced to take one of those dirt roads parallel to the beach and into the neighborhoods. What we didn't know is that we were walking right into the slums. My boyfriend back then was a very cheap guy. I'm not saying everyone from the United Kingdom is, but this particular guy was. So we started fighting once I figured we were really far, but he didn't want to chip in for a cab ride. I got really upset and said, "You know what? Screw it. I've covered for everything on this trip and I'm fed up with it. We're heading back." He started arguing, something like I already spent my money too, to which I interrupted with another snappy comment, and so on and so forth. The fight got a little heated from then on, partly because of, the intense heat, and partly because my feet hurt since it was so hot and I started walking in front of him, getting further and further away from him. As we fought, we headed back toward the beach where we'd come from, and just before we reached it, I saw this young scrawny guy standing next to a bush, right in the corner where we had to turn. I paid no mind since I was so upset and focused on fighting with my cheap-ass boyfriend. When we started getting closer, I noticed the guy was staring at us, and I just thought it was because we looked exotic, a very white, blue-eyed foreigner and the dark-skinned Colombian with the long hair. I made it to the corner first, and I was about to mutter a weak good afternoon, since it's a common courtesy in our land to do so, but the words died in my mouth as the guy quickly stood forward and jumped me. The movements were fast, and I only saw glimpses of what was happening. There was another guy, hidden behind the first one, and he also came forward, but this one went straight to my very scared and frozen in fear boyfriend. The first guy tried to grab my bag as he pulled this huge knife from behind his back. It was a long and wide silver blade, and it shone against the burning sunlight. He kept saying something like, "You fucking gringos, give me the bag." By this time, I fell on the ground. The blow didn't do anything to me, though. I was too concerned about keeping my hands around my bag, holding it tight against my chest. That bag held inside my brand new iPhone, the same I just started paying for. Thoughts raced through my head. What was my boyfriend doing? The guy kept trying to pull the bag from underneath me as I cried, "No!" And he said, "Let go or I'll cut you, bitch." I was rolling on the ground hugging the bag as I saw the shine of the knife again, but this time it went under me and he cut the strap and held the bag as well. He yanked the bag and I stood up as soon as I could, just to see him getting on a bicycle as the other guy was blocking my ex. This made me hate him at that point. The stupid idiot was just held behind by the other guy without even touching him. He was blocking him by just standing there, and my idiot ex just stood there as if he was being held captive by some invisible box. The second guy turned to see his friend getting on his bike and rushed to do the same on another bike parked behind the bush where they'd been hiding. I didn't hesitate, somehow. I wanted to fight for that phone. It's hard to obtain such an expensive item in Colombia, and I've worked really hard for the past couple of years to get a brand new one. It was powered by pure hatred. I hated them, I hated the country, I hated the government, I hated the fact that society's conditions have created such violence and poverty and deprivation. I felt sick of it all. I wanted to bash their heads in. I wanted to be violent as well. They quickly took off on their bikes, and I took off running behind them. My flip-flops flew in the air as my first steps hit the scorching hot dirt road, and the tiny rocks cut and hurt the skin on them. I was fueled by hatred then, and I ran like I've never run before. At the same time, I was screaming. There was people just standing on their precarious house doors. Some of them even came outside as they heard the commotion. I was screaming, "Stop them! They just robbed us! Help!" I never thought I would say such a silly word, believe me. In Colombia, people prefer to be robbed and head home feeling defeated afterwards. Hell, I've done it as well, many times in the past. But this time I was determined. I was tired of being a pushover for lousy crooks that were half my age. I would give it my all. I ran and screamed for 2 blocks, and many people started screaming as well and pointing at them, but no one did anything, and soon enough, they started gaining terrain in front of me. They then turned around one of the corners down the road. I kept running as I saw them turn yet again on another corner. By then, they were too far, and I couldn't follow anymore. I was heartbroken. I stopped running and threw myself on the ground and started pounding on the dirt road, crying and screaming hysterically. I couldn't believe they robbed me so easily, and in such a stupid way. How could I explain this to my parents? How would I even call them? People started walking towards and surrounding me. My idiot ex-boyfriend arrived a few seconds later, jogging slowly, trying to comfort me, but I just wasn't having it. I cried as people asked me, "What did they take? What did you have in the bag?" Between tears, I cried, "Our phones and wallets." But at this point, I realized phone robbery is so common it wouldn't matter at all, so I decided to lie. And our passports. He's from England, and now how is he going to go back? They all started murmuring while a huge, luxurious truck appeared at the end of the road. A very heavy woman yelled right away, "They took their passports! There's the mayor! There's the mayor!" And some other lady asked, "Anyone know who it was?" And I heard another voice saying, "It was Mr. Rosario's son. I saw him." The sounds were now getting confusing. There were at least 20 people around me, trying to comfort me and asking questions. The truck slowly rolled closer, and the heavy lady pretty much jumped in front of it. She was screaming too. They took their passports. That's why we can't get enough tourists here from other places. And more people started complaining to the mayor. I slowly stood up and looked at the man behind the wheel. He was a very heavy fellow, shaved head, no facial hair, and with a stern look on his face. He said nothing. There was a guy next to him. He seemed to be his secretary, and he did all the talking. He asked where we were staying at, what they took, and who it was. I told him I didn't know who they were, but then the heavy lady interrupted me in saying, "It's Mr. Rosario's son. The ones from the slums." The mayor remained quiet and just staring. The secretary then said to a couple of guys standing in the back, "Take them back to their hotel," and then looked at me. "We'll let you know if we find anything." After that, they left. The other two guys took us back to the hotel on the back of their dirt bikes. I felt defeated and weak. When we got back to the hotel, we explained on the front desk what had happened and the reason we didn't have our key anymore. The owner, an elderly gentleman, walked us back, muttering encouraging words, and opened the room for us. I threw myself on the bed and cried. My feet were bleeding and my head felt like it was exploding. My idiot ex tried to console me, but I just scoffed and told him to let me be. I had to make phone calls now, cancel my cards, my national ID document, all that complicated stuff. A few hours passed. I calmed down, took a shower, and started thinking what I was going to do next. Then I heard a dirt bike, and after that a call to our room. The front desk gentleman told us there was someone looking for a gringo couple, so we went outside. It was the heavy lady, riding a beaten-up dirt bike, and boy was she upset. She kept saying she hated when things like this happened, and that the mayor needed to step up and make the town safe for tourists, because that was their whole life income right there, selling snacks, knickknacks, or beer to the tourists on the beach. She then saw the mayor's truck coming down the road and told me, "When he comes closer, we'll demand that he does something or I'll do it myself." The truck came closer, and once again, when the window rolled down, I saw the stern look on that dark face again. He said nothing, but the secretary did. We found a bag, but it didn't have any passports in it. Then he pulled up my mangled bag, strap cut, but it didn't excite me. I muttered something like, "Oh yeah, we checked and the passports were actually in the room, thank God." He gave me a weird look and said, "This is all we could recover. Sorry about that, but people should really have warned you before you entered the slums." I meekly took the bag and felt the weight being way lighter. I wasn't optimistic at this point. I muttered a quick thanks as the heavy lady kept talking about how this could never happen again. This is their town and it needed tourists to come visit and blah blah blah. I just held the bag to my stomach, as if its warmth would make me stop feeling that emptiness inside, but it didn't. I then started walking towards the room again. I opened the bag just to make sure what was left, and surprise! At the bottom of it was my phone, with no case. Just the plain phone, my cards and documents. No wallet, of course. And the room key. I felt like screaming. I took it out and it was on plane mode, which made me assume they tried to unlock it and couldn't since it had a passcode. I couldn't believe my luck. Up until this day, I still can't believe I got it back, and it's so unlikely. It's like finding a green sapphire. The gentleman at the front desk came towards me and said, "They were probably looking at your every move ever since you made it back from the islands. They knew you were here and where and when. Be careful in the future, would you, sweetheart?" To what I only replied with an automated, "Yes, sir, will do." I can't believe my screaming, crying, and hysteria had worked on my advantage. My then boyfriend and I left the next morning, counting our blessings and heading back home. We didn't last for long after that trip, though. He just wasn't strong enough for me. I was already feeling invincible. I was a badass, and I wasn't going to be scared ever again. So, this story happened around mid-2014 when I was a 17-year-old living in Perth, Australia. I was in my final year of high school, and I often spent a couple days of the week studying at the local university library near my house, because I didn't get a lot of work done at home. So anyways, where I lived, and the uni, was considered a pretty safe area, and nothing significant had happened in the area for about 15 years, so I felt quite comfortable walking around at night. One night, after some study at around 7 or 8 p.m., I decided to walk to the service station across the road from the uni to get something to eat. As I was casually walking past the petrol Bowsers, a tall African man in his shitty hailstone-damaged car calls out to me as he was moving his car in neutral gear, as his car seemed to be broken down. I help him move his car into one of the customer bays and help sort his car. He tried turning on his ignition and it wasn't working, didn't even start the engine at all. Then somehow, after a few moments, his car magically started again, and he got into the car. He started asking me weird questions like, "Do you like books? You speak good English. Where do you learn it?" Even though I'm white and have an Australian accent, and "You need Jesus Christ," all out of context and random. I don't remember the whole conversation precisely word for word, but he mentioned something about going to the local recreational center down the road to play a team sport. Thing was, this particular rec center down the road closes at 5 p.m. on a Saturday and is closed on a Sunday, which was really odd since he said he was going there at 8 to 9 p.m. to play sports. What made this even more creepy was the location of the recreational center being so isolated amongst a small national park. A large field, a sleepy soccer, and a farm located on university property, so it's kinda in the middle of nowhere. So, pretty much going there at the time would be creepy and suspicious as fuck. I vaguely remember a pause of silence, and out of nowhere he said, "Get in the car!" At that point I froze and just walked off into the service station and just hung around there for 20 minutes before I ran back to the library in total fear. And the walk to the library is a good 400 to 500 meters through the bushes, car park, past tennis courts, courtyards, etc. Because I remember telling him I was studying at the library, I was worried he would park his car and hide amongst the bushes and ambush me as I was walking back to the library. This was probably one of the most creepiest experiences of my life so far. I pretty much ceased studying at that library for the night and just relaxed and went home. I remember when I was younger, my mother would take us to the Tides restaurant in Bodega Bay. This restaurant was, or maybe still is, a wonderful place to eat right by the ocean. There was a dock right next to the driveway, and you could hear the tide in the ocean pulling back and rushing towards the docks, especially at night when it was dark and the water couldn't be seen. It was truly beautiful. One night, I went with my mother and her friends for a birthday dinner. I was around 12 or 13 years old. I remember because I was kind of a brat then and hung out with the wrong crowd. I had a boombox that I would bring everywhere with me, and I would get bored really fast. While I was sitting there eating dinner, a really cute guy in his 20s walked by. I was pretty sure he worked at the restaurant. Of course, me being a tween who looked like she was 17 didn't help my mother at all. He probably thought I was older, or now I hoped he did. Anyways, he smiled and flirted with me, and I flirted back. He seemed extremely busy, as if there were a lot of people eating that night, and would go back and forth from the kitchen to wherever he was headed. Each time he would smile. He had chin-length feathered hair and wore a blue tank top with jeans. This was the late 70s. As we finished dinner, my mom and her friends wanted to have some coffee. I just wanted to go listen to music. The cute guy seemed to have disappeared, so I was extremely bored, as usual. My mom gave me the keys, and I went out to the Volkswagen van that she proudly drove around in. I was a bit embarrassed by the van, so I sat in the back seat with my feet up listening to music. I heard some yelling outside, and I watched as the cute guy was arguing with a girl. It wasn't that easy to see what was going on because I was hiding in the back of the van, but it looked like he had slapped her. Then she tried to go inside the back door, and he grabbed her arm and pulled her back. She screamed at him as he pulled her toward the dock. I watched, waiting for them to come out and not draw attention to myself. I was scared. Suddenly I heard a scream, a loud, terrible scream from a woman, and nothing. I was shaking all over. I didn't want to get out and run for the door because he started to come back from the boats. Alone. Right when he was at the back door to the restaurant, I started to get up and crawled into the front seat so I could go inside and tell someone. But he turned around right when my hand covered the door handle. He looked right at me. The music was still blaring on my boombox, but all I could hear was my heartbeat thudding in my chest. He let go of the back door, then started to walk toward the van. My heart raced as I locked all the doors and sunk down in my seat. He stared right at me with an angry look on his face that I'll never forget. He was about a car's length away when my mother and her friends came out of the front door. They must have spooked him, because he turned around and went the other direction as they headed toward me. I didn't say a word on the way home. I thought my mother might be mad at me for flirting with such a terrible person, so I kept quiet. Living in an area like Portland, Oregon, you learn to expect a certain amount of weirdness taking public transit. Being a woman living in any major city, you expect to, at one point, likely more, in your life encounter perverts or creeps. It comes with the territory, even if it shouldn't happen at all. This encounter happened a few years ago, but I still remember it. It changed my behavior when wandering alone at night, which is significant for me since I'm an introverted night owl who prefers graveyard shift and shopping at 24-hour stores. In 2008, I was working at a call center, and my shift at the time had me clocking in at 7 p.m. and leaving at 4 a.m. Most nights I would usually leave with a couple of friendly coworkers, and we'd wait for the Blue Line train to roll through, usually only a 10-minute wait on a weekday. At that point, all but one would part ways with me. Most of my coworkers lived closer to Gresham, and at the time I lived in Hillsborough. We were pretty good acquaintances by proxy of being on the same team and taking the same train, but not quite friends. She lived further down the road than I did, so she usually sat with me until I got off. It was sometime in July. I forget the specific day, but it was hot enough even after dark that I opted to go to work in a spaghetti-strap top and shorts rather than my usual t-shirt and jeans. The call center was casual dress, doubly so for graveyard shifts since our manager didn't care what we did as long as it didn't get back to upper management or HR. That night, I was alone for the walk to the max since half my team had called in, my train buddy included. I didn't think much of it, aside from being pissed off and exhausted from the extra workload. I suspected they had all bailed to attend a party a coworker had advertised the week before. When my train came by, I honed in on a deserted section and claimed a forward-facing seat by the operator terminal, intent on ignoring the world and catnapping my way home. Someone getting on with a bike jolted me out of my daze because of the obnoxious clattering they make when people position them on wall hooks. Apparently, scowling is considered a form of flirtation because the bike's owner made eye contact with me, smirked, and sauntered over to take a seat right across from me. It made me even more irritated because the car was deserted aside from two people on the opposite end. I ignored him and stared out the window, longingly waiting for my stop. After a few minutes of being ignored, he leaned across the aisle to get my attention. "Hey, good morning. Work around here?" Polite enough, but I grunted non-committally in return, not in the mood for small talk. It only seemed to encourage him. After a brief pause, he tried again, less subtly. "You're pretty." It's not the first time I've had people hit on me, but generally when I put on my bitch face, they leave me alone, so it made my skin crawl uncomfortably to have it ignored. My disdainful frown didn't seem to register as he took my silence as an invitation to slip over to the seat directly beside me, blocking me in. This sent up red flags and wailing sirens in my head, even aside from the very obvious way he leaned in and peered, clearly trying to see down my shirt. I finally found my voice, leaning away. "I'm not interested." Any normal human being at that point would have realized they were being creepy, apologized, and moved. Not this guy. This guy smiled, reached into a pocket, and pulled out his phone. I was prepared to physically kick him out of the seat if he pointed the camera at me, so I was struck dumb for a minute when he calmly asked, "What's your number, sweetie?" It was as if he wasn't registering my reactions as unusual. Before I could think to respond, he glanced at me expectantly. "By the way, where's your friend tonight?" My blood ran cold, and I felt a little panicked at realizing he'd clearly watched me previous nights, but I didn't recognize him as I'd come to recognize other regulars on the morning trains. Seeing his stop coming up, I stood abruptly. "This is my stop." That finally made him frown, but he switched back to his original seat without comment at having me loom over him. I'm 5'7" without heels. The second there was enough room to move without touching him, I made a beeline for the nearest door, not caring that it was still a good 3 stops from where I needed to be. I was in such a rush to get away from the uncomfortable situation that I didn't register the sound of someone taking a bike off a rack. I intended to just wait for the next train, but as I was walking towards the kiosk to look at the schedule, I finally noticed the clicking sound of bike gears behind me. Too afraid to draw attention to the fact I'd been lying about my stop, I stared straight ahead and kept walking. The platform was deserted, so I knew it'd be a while before the next train came by in either direction. The stop was one I wasn't familiar with, but I recalled that not far from it was a shopping center and a few apartment complexes. I walked purposefully and tried to pretend like I hadn't noticed I was being followed. Since he made no more advances, I got the sick feeling that he intended to follow me home. I stuffed my hands into my pockets to feel for my phone and a small pocket knife I keep out of paranoia for just such a situation. I thought about calling 911, but since nothing physical had happened yet, I knew they wouldn't take it seriously, and didn't want to provoke him with such an obvious gesture. The walk seemed to take forever, even though I now know the shopping center is only about a quarter mile from the stop. The stores and parking lots were deserted, but it was situated on the corner of a busy intersection, and a little further down I could see a lit gas station sign. I walked a bit faster. I must have looked as freaked out as I felt, because when the attendant spotted me through the front window, he came out from behind the counter. When I walked in, he was looking past me. "Friend of yours?" I shook my head emphatically and explained that the man had followed me from the train. The attendant nodded in understanding, discreetly going back behind the counter and picking up the phone while I made my way to the back of the store, staying close to an employees-only door by the coolers. I pretended to browse the aisles as I listened to the attendant talk to whom I could only assume was his manager, finally turning around to see just where the creep was. My stomach dropped. He was just standing outside the window, smiling, staring straight at me. He made no move to follow me inside, but he seemed prepared to wait. More than a little scared, I made my way to the counter. The attendant looked annoyed as he hung up the phone. "My manager's on the way. There's not much I can do until then, since he hasn't done anything. You can stay in here, and if he comes in I can ask him to leave. It should get busier soon." He offered the last feebly, unsettled as well. Throughout the wait, the man didn't budge, just stood there smiling and blinking. It was a tense few minutes until, finally, a car pulled up and a heavy-set older Latino man jumped out. He paused for a moment to assess the situation before approaching the creep. I couldn't hear exactly what it was said, but it sounded like the manager was pissed, and the smile suddenly vanished. I thought I was going to be sick from relief after a few brief moments as the man hopped back on his bike and pedaled off. Shaking a little as the adrenaline began to wear off, I thanked them both and explained what had happened on the train. The manager offered to drive me home. Stranger danger on high alert. I declined. I did accept an offer to walk me back to the Max station, and he waited with me, keeping an eye on the platform, until the next train came. I made it home without further incident, but I was jumpy and paranoid at passing bikes for a good long while afterwards. I stopped going out at night, and instead tolerated sleep deprivation on my weekends to shop during the day. After my train buddy heard what happened, we exchanged numbers, and we let each other know when we'd be calling out sick. I never quite felt secure in my home or at work after that, wondering just how long that creep had been watching without me or my coworker noticing. I declined to renew my lease when it came due, and had a coworker with a car help me move. Shortly after that, I quit work and found a new job on a bus line. When I was 19, I went to school to get certified in a certain medical field. I was engaged to my now husband, and we would be getting married in the next year. Classes were held at night, and the first night I found a seat in the back at a table. Seated at this table was a man in his early 40s. His smile was friendly, so I sat a couple seats down from him. He introduced himself, and we exchanged pleasantries. For the first few weeks, all was fine. We would partner together in class on assignments, and we were both good with the material, so we would get good grades. One night, we were in class and he started complimenting me. My hair, eyes, nails. He touched my hand as he complimented my nails, and I started feeling uncomfortable. I said a simple thank you and ignored anything else he said. As the weeks went on, he began saying inappropriate things about my fiancée. He would say that he would love to challenge him in a fight to see who won, though he knew he would. At this point, I started to distance myself and sat at a different table. One night on a break, he invited me to dinner at the most expensive restaurant in town. He said he would love to take me back to his house after and have some drinks. He said I should leave my fiancée and travel with him. He bragged about the amount of money he had. I reminded him I was engaged and these comments were inappropriate and to stop with them. He laughed it off like he was joking but said okay, that he didn't want to make me feel uncomfortable. The next few weeks, anytime we saw each other, only school-related topics were discussed. I felt at ease again and figured he was just a man trying his luck with a younger woman, and I'd put a stop to it. On the last night, we had a pretty difficult final test and we were allowed to leave after. I was the last to finish and was happy I aced it. In our class, we would walk out the back door to the parking lot. The instructor left through the front door that led to a hallway. I don't know where he was going, and I left out the back. Outside waiting for me was the creepster. "I'm not letting you walk to the car by yourself," he said with a smile. "Oh, I'm okay," I said back. "Come on, I'm parked next to you anyway." At this point, I had no other option. The parking lot was empty save for our cars, and the back door locked from the outside when it shut. I walked, making small talk about the test, trying to get to my car and get it unlocked. When I got there, his car was one space over from mine. His driver's side door was facing my driver's side door. He opened his door first and sat in his car. I had to squeeze past to get to mine. A mistake on my part, but he wasn't leaving first. "Your butt looks incredible in those jeans," he said, his voice low and sending shivers down my spine. "That's inappropriate. Can't take a compliment. I think you need a spanking." At this point, he grabbed me around my waist and pulled me into his car, onto my stomach, across his lap. He hit my butt 3 times. I was screaming for him to stop. He did and let me go. I got out and got into my car, shaken. He laughed and drove away. I never told anyone. My fiancé was already angry with the inappropriate comments. I knew if I would have told him, he would have literally hunted this guy down and probably got himself into heaps of trouble. It doesn't end there, though. I used my certification in that field for a little bit and decided it wasn't for me. A couple years later, I applied for a job as an office assistant. I was called in for an interview. When I went into the interview room, there he was, sitting smiling at me. It was a position to be his assistant. Apparently, he'd worked at this place as a director for years and was currently using his certification for a side job. I didn't even finish the paperwork. I left, not before hearing him tell me how much he would love to have me as his assistant, though. It was about 6 years ago. I haven't seen him since, and I prefer to keep it that way. As you can tell from the title, this Let's Not Meet is a bit of a throwback. 2006 to be exact. This is about my encounter with a guy I met online named Jared. I have no idea how he came across my profile on MySpace because we had no friends in common, but he messaged me wanting to know about me. I saw that he only lived 45 minutes north of me, and I remember thinking he was very attractive, saw that we had a lot of the same interests, and found his statuses hilarious. Even though adding people I didn't know on MySpace was completely out of character for me, I'm introverted, private, and don't really like meeting new people, I decided to add him anyway. We started messaging each other a lot, and he really piqued my curiosity because he was so different from all the guys I had grown up with. His humor was a bit odd, but I still found him to be really hilarious. I remember using a friend's computer to talk to him one night, and she walked up behind me and said, "Who is that?" I told her I didn't know, but I liked him. She then said, "Ask him out." I thought, sure, why not? He only lives 45 minutes away, and he seems really cool. We exchanged phone numbers and set a date for dinner that weekend. Jared told me to meet him at the grocery store near his house, and I could just follow him to his apartment in my car. I thought the idea sounded great. I pull up and only had to wait about 10 minutes or so before he got there. He pulled up right next to me, and I was immediately thrown off. because even though it was dark out at this point, I could still tell right away that he wasn't nearly as attractive as his profile pictures. I decided I wasn't going to be so shallow, and proceeded to follow him to his place. Here's where it starts to get really weird. As we're driving down a two-way road, there's a succession of entrances to different apartment complexes, spaced about 15 feet in front of one another. Jared keeps turning on his blinker, turning in, and then swiftly turning back out, like he's trying to psych me out. I'll admit that the first time it was pretty funny. I thought, you got me. However, that initial feeling quickly fades as he does this for nearly every single entrance on the way to his place, so maybe 9 or 10 times. Now I'm thinking, what the fuck is he doing? I actually became insulted and thought he was trying to lose me at this point. I kept on having to brake, cars are starting to build up behind me, and it's making the drive take forever because I keep having to slow down for this nonsense. Had I not been a naive 17-year-old, I would have followed my fuck this shit instinct and turned around and drove all the way back home. But no, of course not. I chalk all this up to his weird sense of humor and try to give him a chance. We finally get to his apartment. We have a normal introduction and I walk into his place. It's a typical bachelor pad, I tell myself as I see the back of his door entrance is entirely covered in porn. Think a collage of the filthiest smut hung up to convey every inch of this 7-foot-tall door. Okay, whatever. He's a single guy, I'm thinking. Maybe not the classiest guy, but a guy nonetheless. Anyway, we get to talking and he's kind of quiet, but for the most part he's awkward and doesn't even know what to say. It's at this point I notice he's wearing a really raggedy-ass white t-shirt. Weird. It's been about 15 or 20 minutes since we've been at his place just hanging out in his kitchen, and he starts to ask me personal questions. I start taunting him about his awkwardness a bit to A, lighten the mood, and B, get him to change the subject. For example, he asked, "How many guys have you slept with?" And I retort, "Wow, nice question to ask a girl on the first date, Jared. How'd you get this smooth?" He eats it up and thinks we're playing a game. This goes back and forth for about 10 minutes before I ask him when we're going to dinner. He sort of snaps back into reality and says he has to change. Thank God. He comes back out looking pretty sharp. Maybe this night will turn out alright. I could not have been more wrong. We get into his car, which is a pretty decent Mustang, to go to some places he wants to take me for dinner. We're driving for about 15 minutes before he says he needs to make a detour to see a friend. Okay, I said. The friend walks up to my side of the door. They talk for a couple of minutes, and then the friend starts to get into the car. Jared looks at me and asks me to get into the back. At this point, this guy is really starting to get on my nerves. Could he be any more rude? I'm dying in the back seat, thinking this is just the worst, and I can't wait until he dumps this friend somewhere because I'm starving, and I didn't drive all the way up here to hang out with two rude-ass strangers. I have no clue why he picked this friend up. I have a hunch because of how quick the interaction was that he was buying drugs, but I couldn't see into the front seat or hear over the blaring music. As we were driving where I can only presume is back to the friend's place to drop him off, he starts driving really erratically, pulling some more absurdity like he was doing earlier, plus turning sharp corners like he's Dale Earnhardt, but he's really driving like Mr. fucking Magoo. I'm being tossed all over the back seat, and I see the friend is hanging on for dear life as well. Then, when I think it's all over, he starts a turn to go into a neighborhood, but he has to cross a lane of oncoming traffic. As he's making his way through the turn, he stops. I freak out. All I can see are headlights through the tiny backseat window shining and coming right at us. Me and the friend in the front seat are just screaming nonsensically. I don't even remember what I said. I was just screaming. As soon as we're almost rammed by a giant Cadillac that has to slam on their brakes so hard that they fishtail, he peels out, completing the turn. I'm shocked. I don't even say anything. I wait until he drops his now totally calm and collected friend off and tell him I'd like to go home. He drives me back in complete silence. When we get over to his place, he hurries over to my side and lets me out, but he's standing so close that I have to squeeze past him. As I'm trying to get out of his deathmobile, he places the hand he isn't holding the door open with on the other side of me, trapping me in between him and the car. I look at him and he's just staring at me, so to say, "I'm not kissing you." He responds, "Oh, come on, let's just go upstairs." I have to literally hold back a guffaw. I tell him, "Okay, Jared, that's enough for one night. I'm gonna go now and I'll text you later, okay?" He's still staring intensely into my eyes, and I'm just praying he lets me leave. He starts to shift away, and at that moment I think he's letting me go, but he pushes his mouth onto mine so hard that I'm thrown into the side of the car. I struggle free and haul ass to my car, quickly look behind me and see that he's just standing there. I start driving the long 45 minutes home in silence. I'm so relieved that I get to go home to my nice warm bed. All of a sudden I hear my phone. Ding, 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 ding. I hear about 20 messages coming in, and when I look at my phone, I feel sick. The texts read, "Hey, why did you leave? Please come back, I want to play more games with you." Is this a game? You want to play a game? Okay, I'll give you 15 minutes to get back here. And I'm counting now. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I miss you. Please, come back. I don't like this game at all. He sent all of that within a period of about 2 to 3 minutes, around 10 minutes after I left. All I can remember thinking is, what was that? How can someone be so awesome online and then end up being a total weirdo? On one last note, the next morning the entire top right half of my mouth and a bit underneath my nose was swollen and bruised. So, MySpace Jigsaw Tokyo Drift wannabe freak, let's not ever meet again. My stepfather is an idiot. He's an ex-alcoholic drug addict who is heavily involved in several Catholic churches and the local AA community. AA standing for Alcoholics Anonymous, for those who don't know. The drugs and alcohol must have seriously fried his brain because he still has really bad judgment and decision-making skills, especially when it comes to people. He's brought so many sketchy people into my life. Thank God nothing serious happened. I get it. He's trying to help others who are struggling with the same battle he went through, and maybe he is making a difference in some people's lives, but he's been bringing these kind of people into my life since I was 4 years old. Some of them even lived with us for a while. I had kids young. I was 20 when I had my son, and 23 when I had my daughter. When my son had his first birthday, my stepdad and mom retired. My mom had me when she was 40, and decided to travel, going on mission trips with their church and moving to another state. They started working with this Catholic organization that specifically helps people who struggle with alcohol and drug addictions. The church gave them housing among their nuns and priests and paid them a small amount of money to buy food and necessities while they worked with them. One year around Christmas time, my parents came home for the holiday and brought an older nun with them. She was probably in her 50s. My family got together and went to a Santa's workshop, which was super crowded. My mom, stepdad, their nun friend, and my sisters and their kids came too. My daughter was about 6 months old, maybe less. She's a beautiful red-headed baby. I've received many comments from family and strangers on how beautiful she and her red hair are, and probably have a few other stories of people who don't understand personal boundaries regarding children. The nun was immediately taken by how beautiful my baby is and kept touching her, talking to her and wanting to hold her. It was immediately uncomfortable because this was my first time meeting her. Also, she wasn't acting this way with any of the other children that were with us. My son, who was a 3-year-old at the time and has since been diagnosed with ADHD, was a handful and running all over the place, getting into everything. It's so hard going places with him and her without their dad. He didn't come with us because he was most likely working, so I think I was distracted because my son was getting into something he wasn't supposed to, and I let go of the stroller for a second, and this nun immediately took it. She told me she would give me a break, and since she was a friend of my parents and my family was all around us, I decided to let this nun push my daughter in the stroller. Another incident happened where my son was getting into something and I was distracted, again, for less than a minute, when I turned back around and the nun and my daughter were gone. I freaked out and my whole family was still around me. No one knew where this nun went. She didn't say anything to anyone about leaving. My family and I immediately began looking everywhere. Luckily, there were so many of us, and we found the nun at the front of the building right near the exit. It was terrifying. When we found her, she just said she was taking my daughter on a stroll. I decided to leave right after that happened, and so did everyone else in my family. Luckily, I haven't seen her since. So basically, one night about 2 years ago, me and two of my girlfriends were driving home from getting Mexican food. We saw red and blue flashing lights behind us, obviously, assuming it was the police. Amy, who was driving, didn't feel safe pulling over where we were, considering it was the middle of the night and the street we were on and the ones near us had no street lights, so we slowed down but continued on. Amy came to the conclusion that it couldn't be a real police car because it looked more like a shitty old, beat-up car. The car then started to speed up and passed us in the opposite lane. We then decided to call 911, and when she did, the dispatcher confirmed that there were no squad cars near our current location. She told us to stay on the phone and someone was coming to us right away. Then the car tried cutting us off and passing us again. Finally, a real police car came. We pulled over, but the other car sped off and was chased by the real police. We never found out what happened or who they were. Poser policemen, let's not meet again. This happened about a year ago. A little info about myself. I'm a 19-year-old female. I'm also very small. I'm 4'11" and weigh 95 pounds soaking wet. And no, I don't have an eating disorder. My 11th grade year of high school is when this event took place. It was within the first 2 weeks of school and I was a bus rider. We had a new bus driver. Me, being a very social person, I always thanked him for his service and was super nice to him. And I believe that's where I messed up. One day after school, I was riding the bus. I was always one of the first to be dropped off, so when I realized I'd been on the bus for an extra 10 minutes, I was a little curious and just chalked it up to the fact that bus routes get changed all the time. At this point, I've been on the bus for about 30 minutes, and there are 2 kids left on the bus, an old friend of mine and of course myself. This friend of mine lived in a very remote location and there was absolutely no cell service out there, so when we dropped her off, I couldn't call my parents to let them know what was happening. As we were leaving this area, the bus driver pulls into a cemetery and told me to look out my window. When I did, I saw a baby deer torn to shreds. My whole body went into shutdown mode. I didn't know what to do. My initial reaction was to pull out my phone and call my parents, but then I remembered I had no signal. I immediately got up and ran to the back of the bus. Keep in mind, I'm the only person on there. We sit by that deer for a good 10 minutes, and the whole time I'm in the back, and my blood is absolutely boiling. It took everything in me not to run off that bus and look for help. When we started to leave, he just started talking about random stuff, like how he loves his wife and loves his new job as a bus driver, the whole time barely paying attention to the road. I get on my phone and go to Google Maps. Thank God they work even without service. I realized that my house was 15 minutes from where we were, and I was super excited to be going home soon. Boy, was I wrong. This jackass then decides to take a shit ton of back roads and keep talking to me. The whole time I'm sitting in silence with no service on my phone. So about 20 or 25 minutes later, I start seeing landmarks that are around my neighborhood. I look down and there's service on my phone. I immediately call my dad. He doesn't answer. Not even 2 minutes later, we pull into my neighborhood and he drops me off at my house. I wanted to run, but for some reason, I stood in my yard and stared at him, frozen in fear. Eventually, he pulled off, and when he did, I took off running into my house. My parents were in the room freaking out about where I was. My mom started grilling me about where I was and what I was doing. On a normal day, I would get home at like 2:30, so my mom was very upset seeing as it was around 4:45. My dad's phone was dead because he tried to call so many times. I began to cry and tell them everything that happened. My dad was furious and called my school and used my mom's phone to record the whole conversation between my dad, the principal, and myself. My principal was extremely pissed off about what had taken place, as was my dad. My mother was just cuddling me and asking if I was okay and if anything else happened. I didn't go back to school for about 2 days. There was no formal investigation. The school handled it themselves. The bus driver denied everything, and when they checked camera footage, they found the camera happened to be covered by a sticker or something of the sort. Thankfully, nobody believed the bus driver, and he was fired, and I haven't ridden a bus ever since. I know this isn't as creepy as some of the stories on this subreddit, but it's my only one, and it's still the most bone-chilling experience I've ever had. This is my first time posting, and it's by far the weirdest thing to have happened to me. This all took place around 2 years ago. I was 17 at the time, living in northern England. For some background, my mother is a single mother because my dad left before I was born. She works very hard, and in the whole 17 years leading up to this point, it was always just me and her. She'd never had a boyfriend or anything like that. But just before my 17th birthday, this is what happened. It wasn't long before Christmas, and my mother had told me she was speaking to one of her old friends from school on Facebook and was going to ask him to come around for some food and catch up. At this point, I had no male role model in my life whatsoever, so I can't say I wasn't a little excited myself that my mother had finally met someone after so long. On the day he came round, I was out most of the night because my mother had bought me 2 tickets to see 50 Cent for me and a friend as an early Christmas present, so we went and my friend stayed over after. This is when I first made contact with the man I'll call Dan. So he stands up, shakes my hand, and tells me he's heard a lot about me and all seems good. He even brought us food and convinced my mom to give me another early Christmas present, so I liked him already. If only I knew then what I know now. So now that you're all caught up, that happened around November, so fast forward to January, which is when my birthday is, and I was turning 17. Now this had already started to feel a bit weird to me because Dan had already moved into my house, but I just thought he might have been struggling. Even though he always went on about how he worked offshore on the oil rigs, he had 3 houses that are all up for rent and etc. So you would expect him to have a fair bit of cash, but he never seemed to have any. So anyway, my 17th birthday comes and I asked my mom if I can have a party just messing with her because it was obvious she'd say no. And she did. But then Dan overhears and convinces her to let me, and they'll both stay so it doesn't get out of hand. So I invite my friends over and we're having a good time, and I'm really starting to like Dan even though I only had known him for a short amount of time, but he seemed to understand what it's like to be my age. So the party's going good and everyone's enjoying it. Then Dan sits in the front room with us. This is where it started to get a little off. I'm the funny one in my friendship group, so I made my friends laugh quite a lot, but Dan didn't really seem to like it. I don't really know what he was thinking, but he started talking to all my friends as if he were competing with me and was belittling me at every chance he got. I thought it was a little weird, but I'd never had a father figure before, so I thought he was only joking. But as the night went on, it got weirder. He came up to me later on and pulled out a tiny bag with cocaine inside and offered me some. So I had some, and he then said to me, "Don't tell your mom or I'll get into shit." I agreed I wouldn't. Believe me, I'd be in a lot more shit than he would if I did tell her. So anyway, Dan got more and more drunk and then started to like my friends more than I did and made a comment to one of my friend's girlfriends, who was 16 and he was in his late 30s, asking if she wanted to go upstairs, and she said no, and came up to me asking what the fuck his problem was, and I shook it off again, saying he's just messing around. So the party's over. It's a few days later and Dan is acting really weird, not to my face but behind my back. For example, my mom would ask me to wash the dishes or clean my room, and Dan would say, "Don't worry about it, just leave them. You go out and I'll do it." So I said thanks and went out, and when I'd come home the dishes wouldn't be done and my room would be a mess, so I'd get into shit for it. It was just stupid things like that, and it began to make me start thinking. This is where the worst part comes in. My mom and dad are going out drinking for the night, so I invited my girlfriend over to stay the night while they were gone, so we ordered food, watched movies, and then fell asleep. I was awoken by my mom screaming, "No, Dan, please don't," and Dan screaming at her saying, "I'll kill you and your fucking son." So I told my girlfriend to wait in bed and give her a small metal pole from my weight set to defend herself with in case anything happened, and then I proceeded downstairs. When I got downstairs, it was crazy. There was a hole straight through my TV, the glass cabinet had been smashed, and Dan had my mother by her arm, screaming in her face that she's no good and loads of other horrible things. So I shout, "Get the fuck off her." They both freeze, and then calm down, and straight away he says, "I didn't hit her. Do you really think I'd do that?" in the calmest voice ever. So I did what any mature teenager would do and punched the cunt straight in the nose. But obviously, he has muscles bigger than my waist. I'm not the biggest of mammals to populate this planet, so he just tackles me to the floor and punches me. And then all of a sudden someone bangs on the door, but they didn't stop to wait and see if anyone replied. It was just repeated until Dan finally answered the door. My next-door neighbor was there with a pole in his hand, and he said, "Have you been fucking hitting her?" And Dan was extremely calm again and says, "What are you talking about?" I then stand in the doorway behind him, bleeding from my nose, and my next-door neighbor drags him outside, and they both start fighting on the front garden. And Dan had been hit by the pole, so he was bleeding from his head and had blood spewing down his face. The police then arrived. My neighbor obviously called them before he started swinging poles around, which was a smart move. Dan was then arrested, and my neighbor also got taken to court, and my mom, get this, stuck up for Dan. But she was obviously just scared, so I made a statement to the police because God only knows what he would have done if my neighbor hadn't have come. So Dan's now in jail. There's no story about it as proof, but I'm just hoping you'll believe me. The weirdest part about it all is that my mom and I talked about it a few months later, and she said he never had any money. He didn't have 3 houses. He lived with his mother and had lied about it all. He was just living off me the full time and had spent a lot of our money. So for a while we thought we would have to sell the house. My mom is a fighter though, so she worked her butt off to pay all the debts owed and keep the house. But she also said, "He told me you took cocaine and always refused to do things he asked," which I denied at the time, but she knows the truth now that I'm older. But even though I took it, I can't help but think he was trying to get in between me and my mom to bring us down, when in fact it only made us closer. She's fine now, and we still live in the same house. I asked her about why he hit her, and she said, "He said I slept with one of your friends at your party," which was quite funny because my mom wasn't even there, but that just shows you how crazy he was. There were a few more incidents from Dan, so if you want to know more, just comment and I'll get to it when I have spare time. My mom is now with a different man who's frankly one of the nicest people I've ever met, and Dan is married to another woman he was cheating on my mom with the entire time. God help that woman. Personal message from Kingy. Dan, may your asshole gape forevermore. Not me, but happened to a friend of mine a year or so ago. He gets these night terrors pretty often and sees vivid dreams, so this kind of makes the whole happening even more scary. One night, he wakes up in the bedroom and sees a silhouette of a person sitting at the edge of his bed. He reaches for his girlfriend's side of the bed to see if she's sleeping next to him. She's sound asleep, right by him. At this point, he's sure that it's just another horrible nightmare of his, but still decides to speak up and ask if someone's there. No answer. He reaches over, and there's a person sitting at the end of their bed. He freaks out and turns the lights on and sees an elderly, seemingly drunk, disoriented lady just sitting on their bed. It took them until the next day to figure out with the leaser of the apartment that the lady had keys that had access to their apartment 1 floor below her own apartment as well. Almost had a panic attack when he told me about this. I live in a very small town of about 100 people in rural New South Wales, Australia. This happened when my friends and I were 14. My town used to be a very close-knit farming community, but the shift to modern times and the massive drought of the 2000s led most of the businesses to be closed and farmers to move away. The aging population slowly died, and their houses were filled with despicable types. Drug dealers and addicts, thieves and dole-bludgers. It's sad, really, but even now, there are still great people here. What I've always found creepy is, even though a very small population and I've known just about everybody since before I can remember, there have always been people in the surrounding area that no one seems to know. Old loners, mostly, who keep to themselves and no one ever sees them. On top of that, there have been several pedophile charges laid against some of them, and there have been numerous break-ins and attempted break-ins on our homes. Not to mention that for long stretches of time we've been without a police officer, which means a 000 call would take an hour for help to arrive. It gets even creepier the further out bush you go. I've heard of abandoned farmsteads where families have just disappeared, all their belongings including cars left behind. There was even a multi-generational inbred family, reminiscent of the Hills Have Eyes discovered a few years ago, though thankfully that's a few hundred miles from me. Anyway, I grew up and went to primary school here, but we had to travel an hour to go to high school. It took quite a while for my closest childhood friend Tim and I to make new friends. After 2 years of high school, we invited 3 friends to come out to our town to go camping. Tim's parents owned a small property where they kept sheepdogs and horses a few miles from the town. We camped for 5 days there in the school holidays. The first night, as what often happens, we sat around the campfire telling stories. I told a story of some of those creepy loners I mentioned earlier, a pair of brothers that lived a few miles up the road from where we were camping. They were very rarely seen, with a reputation of being creepy hillbilly hicks. I told them the story of how one night they tried to cripple my father over him supposedly stealing their business. They ambushed him at a local weighbridge at night. My father managed to fight both of them off. My cousin also had a run-in with them by taking a shortcut across their field, only to hear gunfire in his direction. My cousin had lied to me before, so I didn't think it was true, but I made out like it was, and later embellished their reputation with the normal inbred cannibal-type crap city folk would expect. On the second night, we decided to go for a bit of a night walk. We were kids and enjoyed fantasy movies and games and had a bit of role-playing fun. One of us, though, was too scared to go out in the dark, so on our walk we decided to play a prank on him. We started screaming and running back to the camp, scattered, saying, "He got Henry!" It worked, and we caused our scared friend Zeb to try and climb an electric fence to escape. I, Henry, came back dirty and bloody, and we hid in the farmhouse until Tim ruined the prank by claiming he heard the brothers skinned people, which caused us to burst out laughing. The next afternoon we hiked up the nearest hill, called Sims Gap Hill. It was a popular walk for Tim and I when we were kids. The fastest way to get to the hill was by taking the dirt road called the Stock Route, which ran parallel to the main tar road which led to the town. The two roads are connected by another called Sawmill Road, which was at the base of the hill. Anyway, we walked down the Stock Route and I pointed out the Hillbilly Brothers' property as we went past it. All you can see from the road are piles of old rusted cars. We reached Sawmill Road and walked across the paddock to the hill and had an enjoyable time. We started climbing down the hill as it got late, but underestimated the time it took to walk across the paddock to the road. By the time we reached the road, it was night, and of course, it happened to be pitch black. As we started walking down Sawmill Road to the Stock Route, a pair of massive bright headlights turned into the road from behind us. Naturally, we got off the road, which meant disappearing into the thick patch of trees between the road and the brothers' property. As the lights caught up to us, the vehicle started slowing. Up until then, we'd thought it was a farmer's ute, but now we realized it was a very old, very loud tractor. Not wanting to be questioned by any meddling adult, I encouraged the guys to hide. The tractor slowed down and flashed a spotlight into the trees, and sped away. The guys asked me who it was, and I said I didn't know. We continued walking slowly until we saw the tractor turn down the stock route and into the brothers' property. Now I was unnerved. The tractor came roaring down the fence line and I yelled at the guys to run. We ran until we came to a small, well-hidden ditch, which we jumped in and laid very still. The tractor stopped right on us and shined the spotlight over the trees. It didn't illuminate the ditch, luckily. The driver stopped the tractor and got off, walking over to the fence. I peered up and saw the silhouette of a dirty, disheveled man with messy hair standing at the fence line, looking around. In his hands was a rifle. In a nasally, Aussie hillbilly voice, he yelled out, "Where are you, cunts?" We didn't dare move. I started thinking what we'd have to do if he climbed the fence and started coming our way, but he eventually turned around and got back on his tractor. It started with a groan, and it rumbled down the other way. I got my friends up and we sprinted towards the stock route, ducking under branches and jumping over fallen trees. We hadn't quite reached it when the headlights were behind us again, roaring up Sawmill Road. We made it to the road and panicked. It was still 2 or 3 miles back to the camp, and we wouldn't be able to outrun the tractor. On the other side of the stock route was a state forest with tens of miles of twisting dirt roads and motorbike trails and goat tracks. Despite how dark it was, and with a strong possibility of getting lost, we dove in there. We hid as he went past again, finding a forest road which led back in the general direction of the town. We followed it for a while, wondering if he'd given up and if it was safe to go back on the stock route. Then he was in front of us, blinding headlights roaring down the forest road. We jumped back into the trees and decided to run. We ran straight past him. Behind us, he turned back on the stock route and started chasing us again. He circled us 4 times, with us hiding, then running, hiding, and then running. When we'd gone far enough that we thought we were close enough to the camp, we ran through the woods and jumped back on the stock route, to be met by headlights. Tim's mother had come looking for us after finding our camp empty. She'd finally found us, and we were still a mile or so from the camp. Needless to say, we quickly piled in and she drove us back. We told her what happened, but she and my parents just said they're weird people and to stay away from them in the future. From 2006 to 2008, I was a student at university in England, studying paramedic science. This course was a 2-year fast track into becoming a qualified paramedic, or EMT. The course involved placements at various points throughout both years. First, we spent an evening and night in a dispatcher's. I'll never forget some of those calls, like a man waking up in bed next to his wife who died during the night. Next, we were stationed with the Patient Transport Service, taking patients to their hospital appointments when they couldn't get there alone. Finally, after a good 6 months for the opportunity, it was time to spend a prolonged placement with the 999 crews. You could choose a couple of preferred locations, and I was fortunate enough to be given the ambulance station close to my home. So I moved back to my parents' house that winter for a full term, leaving my university buddies behind. In hindsight, I wish that I hadn't, because it turned out to give me far less interesting experiences. The station was Buxton, Derbyshire. Google map it. It's middle of nowhere territory. It's also 45 minutes from the nearest hospital, so you better not get hurt badly up there. Only people did. One evening, we respond to a call where a guy's come off his bike on the Cat and Fiddle Run. It's named after a pub by the same name on that road, which passes over the Pennines Mountains. Bikers love to bomb it up and down. It's notorious. The guy broke a brick wall with his body. Legs were over his shoulders. We took him with blue lights to the aforementioned hospital. I don't think he survived. This is where things got messed up. We turn out of our hospital, travel maybe half a mile, and get flagged down by a pedestrian. She shouts through the window that someone has been beaten, badly. We later find out that this was the case of somebody bumping into somebody else at a bar, nothing more. At that exact moment, a guy in a red t-shirt stumbles out from a side street and collapses in the road. I had been in the rear passenger seat of the patient compartment, my mentor and a technician riding up front. They get out before me to help him, whilst I open up the side bay. Stupidly, I climb out as my mentor helps him in. That's the point at which I notice two things. He isn't wearing a red t-shirt. He's topless and saturated head to waist in his own blood. And there's a mob of people heading straight at us. Maybe 10, maybe 15. I forget. I'm still outside the ambulance and pretty much frozen in terror. I'm only 19 at this point and a pussy. This was 2007. Thankfully, my mentor hauls me inside and locks the door instantly. She then turns to me, asks if the rear door is locked, and it's not. They open it from the outside. My mentor pushes them back, and I couldn't believe it, heckles them, telling them to pick on a group of people and not just one man. She then manages to lock the door. What happens next will stick with me forever. And clearly, as I'm telling this story, nearly 10 years on, they begin to try and flip the ambulance. Meanwhile, another guy starts hammering the side window, shatters it, cuts himself wide open with blood everywhere, but keeps going. They were animals. There's a window between the rear and front cabin. We see a police car approaching. He doesn't stop and continues straight past. Please, give UK cops guns. I don't blame him for not stopping. Only later did I find out that the keys were still in the ignition, but nobody had attempted to enter the cabin through sheer luck. Anyway, crazy bloodthirsty hooligan mob, let's not meet again. Now, P.S. After this I finished my course and went off and became an English teacher instead. The number of dead bodies I saw in my time there was enough to haunt me for life. To all you brave service folk, I commend you. Good evening, all. You may remember me from the bloodthirsty mob surrounded our ambulance thread. I thought I'd share my other Let's Not Meet experience, as it's a doozy, and the reason that I wanted to become a paramedic in the first place. The night I'm going to talk about was nearly the last night of my life, and I gained a strong belief in fate after it. It's nearly August 2004. I'm 17 years old and working a late shift at McDonald's, one of my first part-time jobs. It's Saturday, and my best friend, with whom I had just started to go out with drinking, is disappointed because I'm at work. The shift is unusually quiet. At 7 p.m., the manager declares that one of the newbies, myself or another guy, can go home. It comes down to a coin toss, which I win. I know that this sounds dumb, but that coin toss nearly cost me my life. I immediately hop on a bus home, shower, change, and set off to meet my friend. We go to a student union bar on the outside of Manchester. In 2004, we were still enjoying the golden age of extremely lax ID procedures and easily got into the bar on fake ID cards from the internet. We get a little too drunk. I was so irresponsible at 17, we'd mix shots of whiskey, vodka, etc. all into a glass, then down it. Whilst fucking about on the dance floor, I knocked a guy's drink out of his hand. He started to blow up and I promptly walked away. His friends kicked me in the back as I did so. I later learned that he had been kicked out after throwing a bottle at my head, which missed me, so I had no idea it even happened. We left the club, which led out into a passage beside the college it was attached to. This passage fed through onto the busiest road running through our town, but it was 2 a.m. and dead quiet. By this point, my buddy had bumped into some old friends from our high school and didn't notice me break away from the group. There was a petrol station directly opposite, where we would always get sandwiches for the munchies. At this point, my memory is a blur of what could be memories or bits of eyewitness accounts that I've constructed into false memories, so I'll tell it as if I were seeing it now for the purpose of clarity. I was drunk off my face. I walked/jogged towards the garage. A car came from the car park adjoining the passage. It was long, the path, so it easily cleared the car park and got out onto the road before I got there. And as I stepped out onto the road, this car had, unknown to me, accelerated to 30 miles per hour and struck my right leg as I placed it forward on the ground. This is incredibly important to the story and my survival. First, about that car. Oh God, how I was lucky that I was dealing with a chump from the club. He had a typical look-at-me modified car with a low bumper. It was nearly touching the pavement. This resulted in my foot being scooped up. A regular bumper would likely have buckled and shattered my ankle at this angle, so I'm told. So, it hits my right leg. I'm in the middle of a stride, and this saves my life. The car instantly snaps both bones in my lower leg, but crucially, it spins me like a coin on its head around, the side not over the bonnet and roof. I break 2 ribs in my right side as I hit the bonnet, and I puncture a lung, too. My right forearm impacts the passenger side window as I'm flipped around the car, and the glass destroys my arm. I later see in hospital that it was akin to taking an ice cream scoop down to the bone. I bounced off the car and onto the road at this point. My landing couldn't have been any more unlucky. I land on the shattered fragments of window and essentially roll across a lake of glass, shredding my arms. I don't honestly know if I remember this. Writing this story, I get fragments of super realistic memories, but it's like my mind saying hell no and recalling them before I can properly picture them, and it makes me feel sick. I guess that's regression for you. My best friend at the time called my parents and an ambulance. I spent 14 days in hospital, had emergency surgery to repair my leg, cosmetic surgery on my arm, and my leg now contains a titanium bar that's great fun at airports, but apart from some late-day tingling, I walk and run normally. I had a fantastic surgeon fix my arm without the need for skin grafts, too. You might be wondering, why is this on this sub? The driver of the car was Mr. Bottle Thrower. The whole bunch of people outside the club later gave statements that he'd accelerated and swerved intentionally into my path. His girlfriend was riding up front and was covered in my blood. What a lovely bloke. He went to jail, but I don't know how long for. I moved to the south of England several years later.